Hi everyone, welcome to Mr. Evan Crime Stories. I know you can't sleep, so I'll keep you company with true crime stories from the past. Before we get to the story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now let's jump straight into the story one. In the spring of 1981, there was a small community tucked away among the forests of Northern California. Its name was Keddie. The town was surrounded by the Sierra Nevada mountains, where tall trees covered the hillsides, and the roads could become quiet very quickly once the sun went down. It was the kind of place where people could live close to one another, without necessarily knowing everything happening behind the walls of the neighboring homes. At the center of this quiet community was the Keddie Resort, a collection of modest rental cabins. One of those cabins was Cabin 28. It was home to 36-year-old Glenna Susan Sharp, known to her family as Sue, and her 5 children. Sue had not arrived in Keddie looking for anything mysterious. She had simply been trying to build a new life. After separating from her husband, Sue had left Connecticut with her children and eventually made her way across the country to Northern California. By 1980, she and her family had settled in the Keddie area, where Sue rented Cabin 28. Her children were different ages and had their own routines. Her oldest son, John, was 15. Her daughter Sheila was 14. Tina was 12. Rick was 10. And the youngest, Greg, was only 5. The cabin was not large, but it was home. There were neighboring families nearby, and the children had friends in the surrounding cabins. Like many families living in a small community, the Sharps had developed an ordinary rhythm of everyday life. There were school days. There were friends coming over. There were evenings spent watching television. And there were nights when the children slept in neighboring cabins or had friends stay over. Nothing about the family's life suggested that Cabin 28 would eventually become the center of one of California's most disturbing unsolved cases. But on the night of April 11, 1981, several people were inside or around the Sharp family home. And by the following morning, 3 people would be dead. 1 child would be missing. And the questions surrounding that night would remain unanswered for decades. Earlier that day, Sue and some of the children had been moving around the area as they normally did. Her son John had been out with his friend, Dana Wingate, a teenager who was 17 years old. Later that afternoon, John and Dana were seen in the nearby town of Quincy. Meanwhile, back at Keddie, the younger children were spending time with friends. That evening, 14-year-old Sheila decided to spend the night at a neighboring home. It was only next door. There was nothing unusual about the decision. Her mother remained at Cabin 28 with the younger children. John and Dana were also expected to be around the area, and 12-year-old Tina had been visiting the neighbors earlier that evening before returning home. By approximately 9:30 that night, Tina was back at Cabin 28. The younger boys, Rick and Greg, were there too. A neighborhood friend named Justin Smart was also staying with them. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary Saturday night in a quiet mountain community. Children were inside, neighbors were close by, and Cabin 28 was only one small home among many. But sometime during the night, something changed. Investigators would later determine that Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate had been attacked inside the cabin. The 3 victims were found together in the living room. They had been restrained, and the scene showed evidence of a violent struggle. Knives and a hammer were among the objects investigators examined at the scene. Yet one of the most troubling details was not simply what had happened to the 3 victims. It was what happened to the other children. Because while the attack had taken place inside the home, 3 younger boys were still alive. Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin. They were found in an adjoining bedroom, physically unharmed. And then there was Tina. She was not in the cabin. Her absence would become one of the central mysteries of the entire investigation. The following morning, Sheila returned to Cabin 28 after spending the night next door. She was 14 years old. She had left her family the evening before expecting to see them again the next morning. Instead, when she entered the cabin, she encountered something no child should ever have to see. Her mother was dead. Her brother John was dead. And Dana, John's friend, was also dead. Tina was nowhere to be found. The surviving children were still there. The cabin that had been a family home only hours earlier had become a crime scene. And somewhere beyond those walls was a question that investigators could not immediately answer. Where was Tina? The first response was to secure the cabin and begin documenting what had happened. Investigators examined the living room, the bodies, the surrounding rooms, and the possible points of entry. There was no simple explanation. The attack had not happened somewhere far away where the victims could easily be separated from the rest of the family. It had happened inside their own home, and 3 younger children had survived. That fact immediately raised difficult questions. Had the attackers known who was inside? Had the younger children simply been overlooked? Had they been asleep during the attack? Or was there another reason they had been left alive? And perhaps most importantly, why was Tina missing? At first, investigators had no way of knowing whether she had escaped, been taken from the cabin, or had been somewhere else when the attack occurred. The case therefore became more than a triple homicide. It was also a disappearance. The search for Tina began. But there was another problem waiting for investigators. The crime scene itself would become increasingly important because the people responsible had left behind clues, but not the kind that immediately pointed to a name. There were physical objects. There were statements from people who had been nearby. There were relationships between residents of the resort. And there were details about the night that would slowly become more significant as investigators tried to reconstruct what had happened. The timeline was especially important. Who had seen John and Dana? When had they returned? Who had been inside cabin 28? Who had visited? And when had Tina last been seen? Every minute mattered, because somewhere between the ordinary evening of April 11th and the discovery of the bodies on April 12th was a period of time that investigators could not fully explain. The cabin was surrounded by other homes. People were nearby, yet no one had stopped the attack. No one had immediately called for help. And when morning arrived, the family was shattered. The investigation would continue for years. But at that moment, there was one immediate priority. Find Tina. She was 12 years old. She had disappeared from a home where 3 people had been murdered, and nobody knew whether she was still alive. The search would eventually lead investigators far beyond Ketty. But before that happened, detectives would have to understand the final hours inside cabin 28. They would need to reconstruct the family's movements. They would need to separate fact from assumption. And they would have to determine whether the person, or people, responsible for the killings had entered the cabin as strangers, or whether they had been welcomed inside. For now, though, one thing was certain. On the night of April 11th, 1981, cabin 28 had been occupied by a mother, her children, and their friends. By the next morning, 3 of them were dead, and 12-year-old Tina Sharp had vanished. The quiet town of Ketty had just become the scene of a mystery that would refuse to disappear. And the deeper investigators looked into that night, the stranger the story became. The morning of April 12th, 1981, began with a discovery that would change Ketty forever. What had happened inside cabin 28 was no longer simply a family tragedy. It was a crime scene, and investigators now had to answer the most urgent question of all. Where was 12-year-old Tina Sharp? The answer was not inside the cabin. As officers worked through the scene, the surviving children were taken away from the immediate area. They were frightened, confused, and suddenly without the people who had been their family only hours earlier. The youngest children could not provide investigators with a clear explanation of what had happened, and that made the case even more difficult. The scene itself suggested that the attack had been violent and personal. Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate had been found in the living room. They had been restrained. The victims had suffered severe injuries. Investigators recovered weapons and other items from the cabin, and every object potentially connected to the attack had to be documented. But a crime scene does not automatically explain itself. The police needed to establish what had happened before the killings. They needed to know who had been in cabin 28 that evening. They needed to know who had spoken with the victims. And they needed to know whether anyone had seen a stranger entering or leaving the property. Most importantly, they needed to establish when Tina had disappeared. For the investigators, this was the detail that transformed the case. If Tina had been killed inside the cabin, they needed to find her. If she had escaped, they needed to locate her before she came to further danger. And if someone had taken her away from the cabin, then the investigation was no longer only about homicide. It was also a kidnapping. The search expanded quickly. Officers began looking around the resort and surrounding areas. The wooded landscape made the search difficult. Keddy was surrounded by forests and mountainous terrain, and there were countless places where someone could disappear from view. The investigators also began speaking with neighbors. The resort was not an isolated house in the middle of nowhere. People lived nearby. There were other families. There were children who knew the Sharp children. There were adults who had seen the family moving through the community. Someone might have noticed something. Someone might have heard something. Someone might have seen a vehicle. But memory is complicated, especially when people do not realize that something important is happening at the moment they witness it. A person can hear a noise at night and dismiss it as an argument between neighbors. Someone might see a car and never remember its color. A child might see a stranger and think nothing of it, and by the time investigators begin asking questions, those ordinary details can become difficult to recover. Still, detectives continued. They reconstructed the family's final known movements. John had been with Dana. Sheila had spent the night somewhere else. The younger boys had been inside the cabin. Tina had been there, and then somehow Tina was gone. The surviving children became particularly important to investigators, but they were also extremely young. One of the biggest challenges was determining how much they actually remembered. A traumatic event can affect memory in ways that are difficult to understand. Children may remember a sound, but not a face. They may remember a room, but not the order of events. They may remember a frightening moment without understanding what they were seeing. And investigators had to be careful. A question asked repeatedly can sometimes influence a child's recollection. So detectives needed to gather whatever information the children could provide while avoiding assumptions about what they had seen. The investigators were also trying to understand the condition of the cabin. There were no simple answers. If an unknown person had entered, how had they gotten inside? Had a door been unlocked? Had the victims known the attacker? Had the person been invited inside? And if more than one person had been involved, how had they managed to control several people inside such a small home? These questions became increasingly important. The killings appeared to involve more than one victim, but the motive remained unclear. There was no obvious robbery explanation. The violence appeared extreme, and the disappearance of Tina made the situation even more disturbing. Why would a 12-year-old girl be taken? Was she a witness? Was she intentionally targeted? Or had she simply been taken because she happened to be inside the cabin? Investigators could not yet know. They had to consider every possibility. Meanwhile, the story began spreading beyond Keddy. A triple homicide in a small mountain community was shocking enough, but a missing child made it impossible to ignore. The local authorities began coordinating the search for Tina. People looked through nearby areas. Roads were checked. The surrounding woods were searched. Investigators looked for anything that might indicate where she had gone, but the search produced no immediate answer. There was no clear trail, no obvious location, no simple explanation. Tina had seemingly disappeared from the middle of a violent crime scene, and that was terrifying. The investigators were also examining the people who knew the family. That meant looking beyond strangers. It meant considering acquaintances, neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have had a reason to enter cabin 28. This is where the investigation began to grow more complicated. A crime committed by a stranger is one possibility. A crime committed by someone familiar with the victims creates an entirely different set of questions. If the killer knew Sue, they might have known when she was home. If they knew the children, they might have understood the layout of the cabin. They might also have known which rooms the children used. But investigators could not simply decide that the killer was someone the family knew. They needed evidence, and evidence would have to survive scrutiny. As the first day passed, detectives continued working through the details. The bodies were examined. The cabin was documented. Statements were collected. The search for Tina continued, and investigators began developing a timeline. The timeline would become one of the most important parts of the case, because if detectives could determine when each person was last seen, they could narrow the window in which the killings occurred. Then they could compare that window with the movements of potential suspects. Who was working? Who was at home? Who was driving? Who had an alibi? Who could have reached Keddy during that period? And who could have left without being noticed? At this point, investigators had more questions than answers. But there was one fact that stood above everything else. Tina was missing. Her brothers were alive. Her sister had been away for the night. Her mother and brother were dead. And the friend who had been with John was dead too. The pattern was difficult to understand. Why those 3 victims? Why had the younger children survived? And where had Tina gone? The case would eventually become one of those investigations where individual clues took on greater importance only years later. At the time, however, detectives were working with what they had. There were no modern databases capable of instantly connecting every detail. Forensic technology was much more limited than it is today, and investigators did not have the advantage of decades of hindsight. They were standing inside a cabin, looking at the aftermath of a crime, trying to reconstruct something that had happened hours earlier. They had to rely on physical evidence, witness accounts, telephone records, vehicle movements, personal relationships, and the memories of people who had been nearby. The search for Tina continued through the surrounding region. But as the hours turned into days, the fear grew. If she had simply run away, she might have been found quickly. If she had been hiding nearby, someone might discover her. But if she had been taken away, every passing hour made the situation more serious. Investigators needed to know whether someone had left the area with her. They began looking at roads leading away from Ketty. They considered vehicles. They spoke with people who might have traveled through the region. They examined reports of anyone who had seen Tina. But no definitive answer appeared. Then came another problem. The investigation had to move forward while the community was still trying to understand what had happened. The Sharp family had been part of the local community. The children had friends. Neighbors knew them. People had seen them around town. And now everyone was wondering whether the killer had been a stranger passing through, or someone who had been much closer than anyone realized. That question would follow the investigation for years. But in those first days, detectives were still trying to establish the basics. Who had been there? Who had left? What time did the killings happen? And what had happened to Tina? The answer to the last question remained hidden. No one knew whether she was alive. No one knew where she had gone. And no one could explain why a 12-year-old girl had vanished from a cabin where 3 people had been murdered. For the people of Ketty, the silence surrounding the case was almost as frightening as the crime itself. Cabin 28 had become a place people were afraid to talk about. But for investigators, it was only the beginning. Because once the first evidence had been collected, detectives could begin turning their attention toward the people connected to the Sharp family. And slowly, names would begin to enter the investigation. Some would be witnesses. Some would be people who could provide information. And some would eventually become suspects. But before investigators could determine who might be responsible, they needed to understand something much more basic. What exactly happened inside Cabin 28 during those final hours? The answer would depend on reconstructing the night piece by piece. And the first piece of that puzzle would come from the people who had been closest to the family before the murders. The people who knew where the children went. The people who knew who visited. And the people who might have known more about the Sharp family's life than investigators initially realized. The case was beginning to take shape, but Tina Sharp was still missing. And somewhere beyond the quiet roads and forests of Ketty, the mystery of her disappearance was waiting for its first real clue. The first hours after the discovery of Cabin 28 were filled with uncertainty. 3 people were dead. Several children had survived. And 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. For investigators, finding Tina became an immediate priority. The surrounding area was searched carefully. Roads, wooded areas, nearby properties, and places where a frightened child might have gone were examined. At first, there was still hope that Tina had simply left the cabin. Perhaps she had become frightened and run away. Perhaps she had gone somewhere with someone she trusted. Perhaps she was hiding nearby, unaware that the entire community was searching for her. But as the search continued, those possibilities became harder to accept. Tina was only 12. She had disappeared during a night in which her mother, brother, and her brother's friend had been brutally murdered. There was no ordinary explanation for her absence. Investigators began reconstructing her last known movements. Who had seen her? When had she returned to Cabin 28? Who had been with her? And what could the surviving children remember? These questions mattered because the younger children were among the last known people to have been inside the cabin with Tina. But the investigation had another challenge. The children were frightened. They had lost their mother and brother. They had been exposed to something deeply traumatic. Their memories could not simply be treated like the testimony of an adult eyewitness. Investigators had to work carefully. A small detail might eventually become important, but a frightened child might also misunderstand what they had seen. Still, there were pieces of information that began to emerge. The children described people who had been around the cabin. They remembered parts of the evening, and investigators continued comparing those memories with statements from neighbors. The goal was to build a timeline. A timeline could tell detectives when the victims were likely attacked. It could tell them when Tina was last seen, and it could potentially reveal whether anyone had enough time to enter the cabin, commit the murders, take Tina away, and leave the area. The more investigators examined the case, the more complicated it became. There was no obvious motive. The victims had not simply disappeared. They had been attacked inside their own home. And yet the killer had somehow left without immediately attracting attention. The surrounding community was quiet, but it was not completely isolated. People were living nearby. Cars came and went. Neighbors knew one another. The killer had taken a considerable risk. That raised another possibility. Perhaps the person responsible knew the area. Perhaps they knew the family. Perhaps they knew when people were likely to be away from the cabin. Or perhaps the attack had been spontaneous. At that stage, investigators could not know. They had to keep every possibility open. Meanwhile, the search for Tina continued. Authorities began looking farther away from the cabin. If she had been taken, the person responsible might have left the area quickly. Roads leading away from Ketty became important. Vehicles became important. Anyone who had traveled through the area during the relevant hours might have seen something. But there was no immediate breakthrough. Days passed, then weeks. The absence of Tina became more frightening with every passing day. For her family, there was now a terrible uncertainty. If she was alive, where was she? And if she had been taken, who had taken her? The investigators also had to consider whether Tina's disappearance was connected directly to the murders. That question would remain central. Maybe she had been deliberately removed from the cabin. Maybe she had witnessed something and was taken because of what she knew. Or perhaps her disappearance had happened for another reason entirely. Without Tina, investigators were missing one of the most important potential witnesses, and there was no guarantee that she would ever be found. Still, detectives continued working. They examined the relationships surrounding the Sharp family. They looked at friends, neighbors, acquaintances, and people who had reason to know the family. This was standard investigative work, but in a case with so little certainty, every relationship became important. Investigators wanted to know who might have had a reason to harm Sue Sharp. They wanted to know whether anyone had threatened the family. They wanted to know whether anyone had recently argued with Sue. They wanted to know whether John or Dana had enemies. And they wanted to know whether anyone had a reason to take Tina. The answers were not simple. The Sharp family had moved through different places before settling in Ketty. They had friends and acquaintances. And as investigators began looking backward, they found a network of relationships that would require careful examination. But there was something else that mattered: the crime scene itself. Investigators had recovered physical evidence from the cabin. Some of it could potentially identify the people responsible. Some could help reconstruct the attack. But in 1981, forensic science did not have many of the tools investigators take for granted today. DNA profiling was not yet available as a routine method for identifying a criminal. There was no modern system capable of instantly comparing genetic evidence against a nationwide database. Investigators had to rely on fingerprints, blood evidence, fibers, weapons, photographs, witness statements, and traditional forensic examination. And even when evidence existed, it could only be as useful as the technology available to analyze it. That limitation would become important as the years passed. Evidence that might have been extremely valuable decades later could remain unresolved in 1981. But at the time, detectives could only work with what they understood. The case also raised questions about the condition of the cabin. There were signs of violence. There were restraints. And there were objects that appeared to have been used during the attack. Investigators attempted to determine how the victims had been controlled. The fact that several people had been present made the crime especially difficult to understand. If one attacker had been responsible, how had that person controlled the situation? If there had been several attackers, who were they? And why had the younger children survived? These questions were not minor details. They went directly to the identity and motive of the killer. The surviving children could potentially provide the answers, but investigators would have to wait. Tina remained missing, and without her, one of the most important pieces of the story was absent. Then came one of the most difficult realizations. The search had not found her. No clear trail had emerged. No confirmed sighting had solved the mystery, and no person had come forward with information that could explain where she had gone. The case was beginning to settle into an uncomfortable silence. The murders were known, the victims were known, but the killer was not, and the missing child was still missing. For a small community like Ketty, that uncertainty was difficult to live with. People knew that someone had committed an extraordinary act of violence, but they did not know whether that person was still nearby. They did not know whether the killer had left the area, and they did not know whether someone they passed in town might have been connected to the crime. The case changed the atmosphere. A place that had once felt quiet and safe now carried a different feeling. People watched their surroundings. Children were kept closer to home, and conversations about Cabin 28 became difficult. But investigators could not afford to stop. They continued examining leads. Some were promising, others went nowhere, and as they worked through the growing number of possibilities, attention began shifting toward people who might have had knowledge of the family. That would eventually bring investigators to a number of individuals whose names would remain connected to the case. But there was still a major problem. A name was not evidence. A suspicion was not proof. And a strange detail was not enough to establish guilt. Investigators needed something that connected a person to the cabin, the victims, or Tina. They needed something that could survive scrutiny. That meant continuing the slow work of comparing statements, checking timelines, examining physical evidence, and following every credible lead. The investigation was moving forward, but slowly. And then, after the initial search had already begun to lose its momentum, something happened that would give investigators a new direction. A piece of information emerged about Tina. It would not immediately solve the case. It would not reveal the killer, but it would provide investigators with their first real indication that Tina might still be alive. For a case that had begun with 3 bodies inside Cabin 28 and a missing 12-year-old girl, that possibility changed everything. Because if Tina was alive somewhere beyond Ketty, then the mystery was no longer only about where she had disappeared. It was about who had taken her, and whether she knew something that could finally explain what happened to her family. And that question would follow the case for years to come. For the first few days, the questions surrounding Tina Sharp remained painfully simple. Where was she? Investigators had searched the area around Ketty. They had spoken with people who knew the family. They had tried to reconstruct the final hours inside Cabin 28, but there was still no clear answer. Tina had vanished, and because she had disappeared from the same cabin where her mother, her brother, and Dana Wingate had been murdered, investigators had to consider the possibility that she had been taken. At the time, there was no way to know whether Tina was alive. There was also no way to know whether she had been taken by the same person or people responsible for the murders. The uncertainty was enormous. For a 12-year-old girl to disappear without leaving behind an obvious trail was difficult enough. But Tina had disappeared from a crime scene. That meant every possibility had to be examined. Investigators considered whether she might have escaped from the cabin. They considered whether someone had taken her. They considered whether she had been transported away from Ketty. And they continued looking at people who might have known the Sharp family. The search eventually expanded beyond the immediate area. But there was something investigators did not yet understand. The answer to Tina's disappearance would not come quickly. In fact, it would take years. For now, the case remained focused on Cabin 28. The physical evidence inside the cabin suggested that the attackers had spent time there. The victims had been restrained. The house had been left in a strange condition. And there were indications that the person or people responsible were not simply rushing through the home. The telephone had been left off the hook. The curtains had been closed. And the scene contained evidence that would later become increasingly important to investigators. There was also no obvious sign that someone had forced their way into the cabin. That did not necessarily mean the victims had willingly allowed their attackers inside. Ketty was a small community, and unlocked doors were not unusual. The family also had more than one entrance to the cabin, so investigators could not use the absence of forced entry to identify a particular suspect. Still, it raised an uncomfortable possibility. The attacker, or attackers, may have known the environment well enough to enter without creating a scene. That possibility encouraged investigators to look closely at the people who lived nearby. Ketty was not a huge community. Neighbors knew neighbors. Children knew other children. And the Sharp family had relationships with people living around them. That meant investigators had to examine the social world surrounding Cabin 28. Some people were simply witnesses. Others might have information. And a few would eventually attract far more attention than the others. But before investigators could focus on suspects, they needed to understand the movements of the victims. John Sharp had spent part of the day away from the cabin with Dana Wingate. Tina had spent time with friends. Sheila had stayed overnight at a neighboring cabin, and the younger children remained around the family home. These details might appear ordinary, but in a murder investigation, ordinary movements become extremely important. If investigators could establish who was where and at what time, they could begin shrinking the window in which the killings occurred. And once that window became smaller, alibis could be tested. That was the slow process detectives now faced. They needed to separate what people believed had happened from what could actually be demonstrated. The investigation also had to contend with the limitations of the era. In 1981, forensic investigators did not have the modern DNA databases that would later transform cold case investigations. A biological sample could exist without immediately providing a suspect's identity. A fingerprint could be found without producing a match. A piece of evidence could sit in an evidence room for years while investigators waited for technology to catch up with it. That would become extremely important in the Ketty case, because some of the evidence collected in 1981 would remain relevant long after the original investigation had slowed. For now, however, investigators were still trying to find Tina. And then came a development that would eventually change the direction of the case. But it did not happen immediately. The search continued. The days became weeks. The weeks became months. And still Tina was missing. For the people who loved her, this was perhaps the most painful part of all. A murder victim is gone. There is grief. There is a terrible finality. But when a child disappears, there is uncertainty. There is always the possibility that she might be alive. That possibility can create hope. But it can also prevent closure. Every phone call could mean something. Every reported sighting could become important. Every unidentified body could raise the same terrible question. Could this be Tina? And then years passed. The investigation did not simply disappear. People continued to ask questions. Investigators continued to examine leads. But without Tina, one of the most important pieces of the mystery remained missing. Then, in 1984, nearly 3 years after the murders, something was discovered in a remote area of Northern California. A person collecting bottles came across human remains near an area known as Camp 18 in Butte County. At first, there was no immediate way to know who the remains belonged to, but the discovery was reported, and investigators began examining the remains. The location was far from Cabin 28. That alone was disturbing, because if the remains belonged to Tina, it would mean that she had not simply wandered away from Ketty. She had somehow ended up many miles from the cabin. The remains were eventually identified as those of Tina Sharp. The news changed the case. For years, Tina had been a missing child. Now investigators knew that she had not survived. The case was no longer a triple homicide with a missing girl. It was a quadruple homicide, and the discovery created a new question. How had Tina traveled from Ketty to the location where her remains were found? Had she gone there willingly? Had someone taken her? Had she been alive for some time after leaving Cabin 28? Or had she been killed closer to the time of the original attack? The answers were not immediately available, and that meant investigators had to revisit the entire case. The discovery also meant that the original crime scene had to be looked at differently. Tina's disappearance was not an unrelated mystery. It was part of the same tragedy. Someone had entered Cabin 28. 3 people had been killed. Tina had disappeared, and her remains were later found far away. The connection was difficult to ignore, but knowing that Tina had died did not tell investigators who was responsible. It only made the unanswered questions more serious. The investigation now had another body to account for, another victim, another timeline, and another set of circumstances that needed to be explained. The location where Tina was found also raised questions about transportation. Someone had apparently moved or accompanied her away from Ketty. If she had been abducted, how had she been transported? Who had access to a vehicle? Who could have traveled that distance without attracting attention? And when had the journey taken place? These questions became part of the larger investigation. But there was another important issue. The case had never produced a clear explanation for the original motive. Why had Sue Sharp been attacked? Why John? Why Dana? And why Tina? Were they all targeted for the same reason? Or had the crime begun with one intended victim and expanded into something much larger? Investigators would eventually consider different theories. Some would focus on Sue. Others would focus on people connected to John and Dana. And some theories would center on Tina herself and the possibility that she had witnessed something that made her dangerous to the people responsible. But theories were not enough. The investigation needed evidence, and the evidence had to connect a person to the crime. For years, that connection remained elusive. The case became one of those mysteries that seemed to gather questions faster than answers. Then came another important development. Investigators began looking more closely at people who lived near Cabin 28. One of those names was Martin Smart, a man who lived nearby with his wife Marilyn. Smart had been part of the local community. His connection to the area meant investigators were interested in what he knew about the Sharp family and what he might have known about the events surrounding the murders. Another name would eventually become closely connected to the investigation as well, John Bobabade. But at this stage, investigators were still trying to determine what, if anything, connected these men to the crime. And that distinction matters. Over the years, many theories about the Ketty murders have been presented as if they were established facts. But the case has never resulted in a murder conviction. Investigators have developed suspects and theories, and later evidence has pointed in certain directions. Yet suspicion is not the same thing as proof. The mystery of Cabin 28 remains officially unsolved. That is what makes the story so unsettling. There are names. There are theories. There are pieces of evidence. There are statements. And there are clues that became more interesting as forensic technology improved. But no courtroom ever produced a final answer. And the Sharp family never received the certainty that comes with a completed prosecution. In the years following the murders, some of the people connected to the investigation would die. Others would move away. Evidence would be stored. Memories would fade. And the case would become colder. But it would never completely disappear. Because one question remained. Who walked into Cabin 28 that night? And why? The answer would eventually lead investigators back toward people who had lived only a short distance from the Sharp family. And as those connections became clearer, the story of Cabin 28 would take an even darker turn. Because the possibility that the killers had not come from some distant place, but had been living close to the victims, would become one of the most disturbing theories surrounding the case. And that was where the next stage of the investigation would begin. As investigators looked deeper into the Ketty murders, the focus slowly moved away from the question of whether Tina had been taken. They now knew she had died. The question was becoming much more difficult. Who had taken her? And more importantly, who had entered Cabin 28 that night? The answer might not have been found far away. It might have been much closer to home. Ketty was a small community, and Cabin 28 was surrounded by other homes. People living nearby knew the Sharp family, knew their children, and knew the general layout of the resort. That made the investigation different from a crime committed in a completely unfamiliar location. Someone who knew the area would have understood the roads. They would have known where the cabins were. They would have known which families lived nearby. And they might have known when people were likely to be home. One of the cabins close to the Sharp family belonged to Marty Smart, his wife Marilyn, and her children. Smart had arrived in Ketty around 1980 and worked at the resort's restaurant. His household was only a short distance from Cabin 28. That connection alone did not make him responsible for the murders. But investigators naturally wanted to know more about the people who lived so close to the victims. There was another important connection. Marilyn Smart's 12-year-old son, Justin, was friends with the Sharp children. On the night of the murders, Justin had been staying at Cabin 28 with Rick and Greg. That meant the Smart family was connected to the crime scene in a very direct way. Justin had survived. His mother lived nearby. And investigators now had to understand everything they could about the people surrounding the Sharp family. Another man connected to the Smart household was Severin John Bo Babade. He was staying with the Smarts around the time of the murders. According to later accounts of the investigation, Babade and Smart were both in Keddie on the night of April 11, 1981. The investigators had to determine where these men had been that night. That meant examining their movements, their statements, their relationships, and their behavior after the murders. One detail became especially important. Smart and Babade had reportedly been at the local bar that evening. They were not alone. Marilyn Smart was with them. According to later reporting, the three eventually left the bar during the night. That fact might have seemed ordinary at the time, but investigators were trying to establish a timeline. If the murders happened during the same period, then every minute mattered. When did they arrive at the bar? When did they leave? Where did they go afterward? And when did they return? Those questions would become increasingly important. There was also another part of the timeline that investigators had to examine. John Sharp and Dana Wingate had been away from Keddie earlier in the evening. At some point, the two teenagers returned to the area. Later investigations suggested that someone had given them a ride back toward Cabin 28 sometime between approximately 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. But that created another unanswered question. Who gave them the ride? For years, the identity of that driver remained unclear. Eventually, investigators were able to identify and interview the person who had driven them. That information helped investigators reconstruct the final hours of John and Dana's lives. But it still did not explain what happened after they returned. At some point, the two boys were inside Cabin 28. Sue was there. The younger children were there. And Tina was there. Then the attack occurred. The question was how. Investigators found evidence suggesting the victims had been restrained using different types of tape and cord. That detail was important because it suggested preparation. Someone had brought materials into the cabin or had access to them. The violence also appeared to involve more than one type of weapon. A hammer was believed to have been used. Knives were involved, and investigators later examined the possibility that another weapon may have been present. The crime did not look simple. It appeared chaotic, but there were also indications that someone had taken control of the situation. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe this had not been an impulsive attack. Maybe someone had gone into Cabin 28 with a plan. But investigators could not simply assume that. They needed to determine whether the evidence supported it. The surviving children were particularly important. 3 boys had been inside the cabin and survived. Their location in another room meant they might have heard something. They might have seen someone. They might have remembered voices, clothing, movements, or other details. But there was a problem. They were children, and what they experienced was traumatic. In the days following the murders, investigators tried to obtain descriptions of people who might have been involved. One of the boys eventually provided information that helped investigators create sketches. The descriptions were not perfect. They were based on the memory of a frightened child, but they became part of the case file, and those sketches would remain associated with the investigation for decades. The investigators now had another difficult task. They had to compare those descriptions with the people who were known to have been around Keddie, and that meant looking at the people who lived close to Cabin 28, including Smart, including Babade, and including others whose names would eventually become connected to the investigation. But suspicion alone was not enough. The police needed physical evidence. They needed something that could connect a suspect to the cabin, and in 1981, that was far more difficult than it would be today. DNA profiling was not yet a routine investigative tool. A biological sample could potentially exist, but investigators could not simply send it into a modern database and receive the name of a suspect. That limitation would eventually become one of the most important aspects of the case, because decades later, investigators would return to evidence collected inside Cabin 28. But in the early 1980s, they had to rely on more traditional forensic methods. Fingerprints, blood evidence, fibers, weapons, statements, and physical objects. One such object would become especially important years later: a hammer. During the original investigation, Smart reportedly told authorities that one of his hammers had gone missing around the time of the murders. That detail might have seemed insignificant, until decades later. In 2016, investigators recovered a hammer from a pond near the Ketty resort. Its description reportedly matched the hammer Smart had said was missing. The discovery did not automatically prove who had used it. Rust and time had taken their toll. But investigators hoped that modern forensic examination might reveal something hidden beneath the decades of corrosion. The hammer was not the only item that would later attract attention. A hunting knife was also recovered in the Ketty area. Again, investigators hoped that modern technology might reveal information that could not have been obtained in 1981. For the families of the victims, this was a reminder that the case had never completely disappeared. But before those later discoveries, the investigation had gone through years of frustration. The original case had produced no arrest for the murders. Tina had been found in 1984, yet the person responsible for her death remained unidentified in court. And as the years passed, people who had once been central to the investigation moved away or died. The case became colder. But investigators never completely abandoned the possibility that evidence remained. One of the most intriguing developments would come from an unexpected source. A piece of evidence connected to the tape used during the attack was eventually examined with modern DNA technology. Investigators reported that a DNA profile obtained from a piece of medical tape found near Sue Sharp matched a living person of interest. That was significant, but again, it was not the same as a conviction. A DNA match to a person of interest could potentially tell investigators that the individual had been connected to the evidence. It did not, by itself, establish exactly what that person had done. And because the case remained unsolved, investigators continued to treat the evidence as part of a much larger picture. The mystery was becoming a puzzle made from pieces separated by decades. A hammer, a knife, tape, old statements, descriptions, witness accounts, and the movements of people around Cabin 28. Each piece had to be considered carefully. Then there was the strange anonymous telephone call. Years after Tina disappeared, human remains were discovered near Feather Falls. The discovery was made in 1984, and the remains were eventually identified as Tina's. But an anonymous caller contacted authorities after hearing news about the discovery. The caller specifically mentioned the missing girl from the Ketty murders. The existence of that recording would become significant decades later when investigators found it among the old case material. Who was the caller? How did he know enough about Tina to make that connection? Was he simply someone following the news? Or did he know something about what had happened? There was no simple answer, and that was the problem investigators had faced from the beginning. Almost every major clue seemed to create another question. The closer they looked, the more complicated the case became. Still, one possibility began to stand out. Perhaps Sue Sharp had been the primary target. If that were true, then the murders of John and Dana could have happened because they were present at the wrong time. And Tina could have become a victim because she witnessed something. But this was only one theory. Other possibilities remained. The investigation could not be built around an assumption. It needed evidence. And there was another reason investigators were cautious. Over the years, stories surrounding the Ketty murders had become increasingly complicated. People remembered things differently. Some information came from investigators. Some came from later researchers. Some came from witnesses. And some came from theories that had never been proven. A responsible investigation had to separate those categories. What was confirmed? What was suspected? What was merely possible? That distinction remains important even today, because the Ketty murders have never resulted in a completed prosecution. There are people who have been described as suspects or persons of interest. There are investigators who believe they understand what happened. But there has never been a courtroom verdict explaining exactly who killed Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. And so the mystery remains. What happened inside Cabin 28? Why was Tina taken? And how could 4 people be murdered in a small community without the killer being identified? The answer might have been hidden in the evidence all along. Perhaps the original investigators simply did not have the technology to see it. Perhaps an important witness remembered something incorrectly. Or perhaps someone who knew the truth stayed silent. As the investigation continued, attention increasingly returned to Martin Smart and John Babade. Both men were connected to the area. Both had been in Keddie around the time of the murders. And both would eventually become central figures in theories about the crime. But neither man was convicted of the murders. That fact cannot be overlooked. The case remained unsolved. And the next question would be even more difficult. If investigators were right to focus on people close to the Sharp family, what was the motive? Why would anyone want Sue Sharp dead? Why would John and Dana have to die? And why would Tina be taken away from the cabin? The answers to those questions would lead investigators into the troubled relationships surrounding the people of Cabin 28. And once those relationships were examined closely, the quiet surface of Keddie would begin to look very different. Because behind the ordinary cabins, school days, friendships, and family routines were conflicts that may have mattered far more than anyone realized on that April night. And somewhere inside those relationships could be the reason 4 people never made it home from Cabin 28. The investigation was about to move from the crime scene itself to the lives of the people connected to it. And that was where the mystery became even darker. By now, investigators had a clearer picture of the tragedy. For people were dead. Tina Sharp had been found years after disappearing. And yet the person responsible had never been brought before a court. The case had begun inside one small cabin in Keddie, but the investigation was slowly moving outward. Instead of looking only at the physical evidence inside Cabin 28, investigators were beginning to examine the people who lived around it. And one name continued to appear: Martin Smart. Smart lived in nearby Cabin 26 with his wife, Marilyn, and her children. His stepson, Justin, was one of the children who had been inside Cabin 28 on the night of the murders. That connection alone made Smart someone investigators needed to speak with. But there was another reason. Smart had been in Keddie on the night of April 11th, and so had a man who was staying with him. His name was John Babade. Babade was not simply another neighbor. He had a criminal history, and his presence in the small community was something investigators naturally wanted to understand. Both men were questioned after the murders, but neither was charged with the killings. At this stage, however, it was important not to confuse suspicion with proof. There was no courtroom finding that Smart or Babade committed the murders. They became major suspects in later investigations, but the case remains officially unsolved. Still, investigators had to examine their movements. Where had they been that night? Who had seen them? When had they returned to their cabin? And what had they done after leaving the area? These questions became particularly important because Keddie was small enough that movements could potentially be reconstructed through witnesses. Smart and Babade had reportedly spent part of the evening at a local bar. That might sound completely ordinary, but the timing mattered. Investigators were trying to establish the period during which Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina were inside or near Cabin 28. If the men were somewhere else during that entire period, their alibis could potentially be checked. But if there were unexplained gaps, investigators would have to look more closely. That was the nature of a cold investigation. A person did not become suspicious simply because their story was unusual. Investigators needed to determine whether the story could be supported by other evidence. And there was another important complication. The people who knew the Sharp family were not necessarily suspects. Some were simply witnesses. Some were friends. Some were neighbors. Some had children who knew the Sharp children. And some had only brief contact with the family. The challenge was separating those relationships. One of the most important people to speak with was Marilyn Smart. She knew the Sharp family. Her son Justin was friends with the Sharp boys, and her husband was living only a short distance away. Anything Marilyn could remember about that evening could potentially help investigators reconstruct the timeline. The investigators wanted to know when everyone had been at the bar. They wanted to know when the Smarts returned home. They wanted to know whether Martin and Babade remained there. And they wanted to know whether either man left again. These details would become more significant over time. But there was another piece of evidence that investigators could not ignore. A hammer had reportedly disappeared from the Smart residence around the time of the murders. That detail would become extremely important years later. At the time, however, it was only one more fact in an investigation filled with uncertainty. A missing household tool did not automatically prove anything. A hammer could disappear for many innocent reasons. But investigators had to record the detail because the crime scene itself involved blunt force injuries. And if a missing hammer could somehow be connected to the weapon used during the attack, it could become much more significant. The investigation continued. Meanwhile, investigators were also trying to understand what happened to Tina. Her disappearance was still one of the most mysterious aspects of the case. When her remains were eventually discovered in 1984, investigators knew she had not simply wandered away, but they still had to determine when and how she had died. The location where she was found was roughly 60 miles from Keddie. That meant somebody, or something, had carried her story far beyond Cabin 28, and this created a problem for the timeline. If Tina had been taken from the cabin on the night of the murders, whoever took her would have had to travel away from Keddie. That required transportation, it required time, and it potentially required someone who knew the roads. Investigators began thinking about what kind of person could have moved around the area without attracting attention. The surrounding forests were extensive, but roads connected the communities. A vehicle traveling away from Keddie might not have seemed unusual. People drove through the area every day. A person carrying a child would not necessarily attract attention if nobody knew that a crime had taken place. That was one of the most frightening possibilities. The person responsible might have been able to leave simply because nobody knew what had happened yet. By the time the murders were discovered, the trail could already have been cold. Still, investigators kept working, and as they reviewed the evidence, they found themselves returning to the same difficult question. Was Sue Sharp the intended target? If she was, then the rest of the tragedy might have unfolded because other people happened to be present. But if Sue had not been specifically targeted, then investigators needed another explanation. Why had 4 members of the same family and their friend become victims? There was no easy answer. Sue had separated from her husband and moved across the country with her children. She had created a new life in California. She had friends. She had neighbors. She had relationships. Like almost everyone, she had a past. But a complicated personal history does not mean someone is responsible for a murder. Investigators had to be careful not to create a motive simply because they needed one. A motive could explain a crime. It could help investigators understand why someone might have acted. But motive alone could not identify a killer. Evidence had to do that. And in Keddie, the evidence was scattered. Some of it was inside the cabin. Some was in the memories of witnesses. Some existed in old statements. And some would not even be discovered until decades later. That was one of the reasons the investigation became so difficult. The first investigators were working in 1981. The later investigators were looking backward from the perspective of the 21st century. They had technology the original investigators did not have. They had access to old records. They could re-examine evidence. And they could ask questions that had not been asked properly the first time. But even modern investigators could not change what had happened in those first hours. The original crime scene had already been processed. Witness memories had already begun to change. People had moved. Some had died. And evidence could disappear. The longer a case remained unsolved, the more difficult it became. Still, one thing continued to draw attention. The restraints. The victims had been tied. This suggested that whoever carried out the attack had been able to control the situation for at least some period of time. That was important. A sudden argument that turned violent was one possibility. But tying people up created another. It could indicate preparation. It could indicate that someone had brought materials with them. Or it could indicate that the attackers had found what they needed inside the cabin. Investigators had to determine which explanation best fit the evidence. And the presence of several victims made the situation even harder to understand. There were 3 people found together in the living room. The younger boys were nearby. Tina had vanished. How could the attackers control the room without attracting the attention of neighbors? And why did the younger children survive? Perhaps they were asleep. Perhaps they were frightened into silence. Perhaps they never fully understood what was happening. Or perhaps the attackers deliberately chose not to harm them. There was no definitive answer. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was precisely this uncertainty. Investigators could reconstruct pieces of the night, but there were gaps. And those gaps created room for theories. Over the decades, many theories would emerge. Some would focus on Smart and Babade. Some would focus on Sue's relationships. Some would focus on John and Dana. Some would focus on Tina. And some would involve people who were never publicly established as suspects. But not every theory deserved the same weight. That is something investigators had to remember. A theory becomes useful only when evidence supports it. Without evidence, it remains a possibility. And the Ketty investigation was filled with possibilities. Then there was the question of the vehicle. Witnesses reportedly remembered seeing a green van near cabin 28 that evening. If that observation was accurate, it could become an important part of the timeline. Who owned it? Who was driving it? Why was it there? And did it have anything to do with the murders? The problem was that seeing a vehicle near a cabin does not establish a connection to a crime. A vehicle can be present for completely innocent reasons. The driver could be visiting a neighbor. They could be dropping someone off. They could simply be passing through. But because the crime occurred during the same general period, investigators had to follow the lead. Every possibility had to be checked. That was the slow, frustrating nature of the investigation. One clue could produce another clue. One answer could create two new questions. And sometimes a promising lead would lead nowhere. As the investigation continued, the focus returned repeatedly to the people living around cabin 28. Martin Smart remained important. John Babade remained important. And the people who had been with them that evening remained important as witnesses. But investigators still did not have enough to make an arrest. And as the years passed, the case began to cool. Tina's remains had been recovered. The family had been buried. The community slowly returned to normal. But the question of who had killed them remained. Then something happened that would make the investigation even more complicated. A letter connected to Martin Smart would eventually come to light. It had not immediately become the breakthrough investigators needed. But years later, when the case was being reviewed again, the wording of that letter attracted attention. The letter contained a disturbing reference to 4 people's lives. For investigators looking back at the case, the wording was impossible to ignore. But again, it was not the same as a confession entered into court. The context mattered, the circumstances mattered, and the person who wrote the letter was never convicted of the murders. The letter became one of the many pieces that investigators and researchers would debate. Was it an expression of guilt? Was it a reference to something else? Was it misunderstood? Or did it reveal something that had been hidden for decades? There was no courtroom answer, and that distinction remains important, because the Ketty murders are not a story with a neatly established ending. They are a story where evidence, suspicion, memory, and theory overlap. And sometimes the most disturbing clues are the ones that never receive a final explanation. As the years passed, Smart and Babade eventually left Ketty. Both would later die. Smart died in 2000. Babade died in 1988. Neither was ever charged with the murders. That meant investigators lost the possibility of questioning them again. Whatever either man knew, if they knew anything, could no longer be tested directly against new evidence. The case remained behind, and so did the questions, but the story was not finished. Because decades after the murders, investigators would begin reopening old evidence. And one of the most remarkable discoveries would come from a place that had been sitting quietly for years. A piece of evidence that had once seemed ordinary would suddenly become important. Then another object would be found, a hammer. It was discovered in a pond near Ketty in 2016. Investigators noted that it matched the description of a hammer Smart had previously said was missing. The discovery did not solve the case, but after more than 3 decades, it gave investigators another physical object to examine. The case was no longer being investigated only through old memories. There was now new evidence. Modern forensic methods could be applied, and investigators could revisit material collected long before DNA testing was routinely available. The possibility was both exciting and frustrating. What if the answer had been sitting inside the old evidence all along? What if technology could reveal something the original investigators could not see? And what if one of those discoveries could finally connect the crime scene to a person? The investigation was entering a new era. The names of the old suspects were still there. The victims were still waiting for justice. and the evidence from cabin 28 was being looked at again. But there was one final question that would become increasingly important. Could modern science finally speak for the 4 people who had been silenced in 1981? The answer would come from something far smaller than a hammer. Something that could easily have been overlooked. Something that had been left behind at the crime scene. And when investigators finally examined it with modern technology, the Ketty case would receive one of its most important developments in decades. The old evidence was about to tell a new story. For more than 3 decades, the Ketty murders remained trapped between 2 worlds. In one world were the memories of 1981. Witnesses remembered what they had seen. Investigators remembered what they had been told. Families remembered the people they had lost. And somewhere inside those memories were details that might have been important. But memories fade. People move. Stories change. And sometimes, after enough years have passed, even a sincere memory can become difficult to separate from everything that happened afterward. The other world was physical. The objects left behind. The photographs. The evidence collected from cabin 28. The pieces of material that had survived long after the investigators who originally handled them had moved on. That evidence could not remember incorrectly. But it had another problem. In 1981, investigators did not have the technology available today. Something that seemed useless then could become valuable decades later. And that possibility would eventually bring investigators back to one of the smallest objects connected to the crime. Tape. During the murders, the victims had been restrained. Tape had been used as part of that restraint. At the time, investigators collected the material as evidence. But there was no way to know how important it might eventually become. Years later, modern forensic technology allowed investigators to examine biological material that earlier investigators could not identify. And one particular piece of evidence began attracting attention. A piece of medical tape recovered from the crime scene contained a DNA profile. Investigators reported that the profile matched a person who had become a person of interest in the case. That development did not instantly solve the murders. It did something more complicated. It gave investigators another piece of the puzzle. The DNA could potentially tell them that a particular person had contact with the evidence. But contact alone does not automatically explain why. A DNA profile can show that biological material was present. It does not always tell investigators exactly when it was deposited. It does not automatically explain how the person came into contact with an object. And it does not, by itself, recreate an entire crime. That meant the evidence had to be considered alongside everything else. The old statements, the timeline, the relationships, the physical evidence, and the movements of the people connected to cabin 28. That was the difference between a clue and a case. A clue can point investigators in a direction. A case requires enough evidence to establish what happened and who was responsible. The Ketty investigation still had gaps. But the possibility of obtaining useful DNA from evidence collected in 1981 was significant. Technology had changed. The evidence had not. And that meant the past could finally be examined using tools that investigators in the original case had never possessed. This was not limited to DNA. Investigators also revisited other physical evidence. The hammer recovered from a pond near Ketty was examined. The location itself was interesting. The pond was close to the area where the murders had occurred, and the hammer reportedly matched the description of one that Martin Smart had said was missing around the time of the murders. Again, this did not automatically make it the murder weapon. A hammer found decades later could be connected to the crime, or it could be unrelated. The object had spent years exposed to the elements. Water, rust, dirt, and time could destroy evidence. But investigators were willing to examine it, because even a small discovery could matter. They were looking for traces, anything that might connect the object to a victim, anything that might connect it to the cabin, anything that could provide a biological profile, anything that could establish whether it had actually been used during the attack. The challenge was that the evidence had survived for decades under difficult conditions. Forensic science is powerful, but it is not magic. Time can destroy information. Weather can destroy information. Handling can destroy information. And sometimes there simply is not enough biological material left to analyze. Still, investigators continued. The case had waited more than 30 years. There was no reason to assume that every possible avenue had already been exhausted. Then there was the question of the knife. A hunting knife was also recovered during the renewed investigation. Like the hammer, it was examined for possible connections to the crime. The investigators were essentially asking the same question again and again. Can this object place someone inside cabin 28? If the answer was yes, the next question would be even more important. Why were they there? The investigation was becoming a process of connecting separate pieces. One clue might point toward a person. Another might establish a timeline. Another might explain a relationship. Another might reveal something about the crime scene. None of them necessarily solved the case alone. But together, they might eventually create a picture. That picture was still incomplete. And that was why the case remained officially unsolved. No matter how suspicious a person appeared, investigators needed enough evidence to prove their involvement. No matter how strange a statement sounded, investigators needed corroboration. And no matter how convincing a theory seemed, it could not replace physical evidence. This distinction became particularly important because the Ketty murders had attracted enormous attention over the decades. The case had become the subject of documentaries, articles, podcasts, online discussions, and amateur investigations. With each retelling, details could become mixed together. A theory could begin sounding like a fact. A rumor could become part of the accepted story. A person described as a suspect could eventually be described as the killer, even though no court had ever established that. Investigators had to work differently. They had to ask what could actually be supported. And one thing was clear. The murders had never been solved in court. The Sharp family had never received the final answer they deserved. Tina's death had been confirmed, but the person responsible remained free from conviction. Then came another important piece of information from the old case files. An anonymous call. Years earlier, after Tina's remains had been found, someone contacted authorities. The caller knew about the Ketty case. He knew about Tina, and the recording remained among the evidence. Decades later, investigators rediscovered that recording. That was significant because voices can sometimes be analyzed in ways that were not available to investigators decades earlier. The recording could be preserved. The voice could be compared. And perhaps the identity of the caller could be established. But again, there was no guarantee. A person could know about a case simply because they had heard about it. The caller could have been someone connected to the crime, or someone who had simply followed the news. The investigators had to determine which possibility was more likely. The anonymous call therefore became another piece of the larger puzzle. The case was starting to look less like an investigation frozen in 1981 and more like an investigation that had been reopened across time. Evidence from the original crime scene was being examined with modern technology. Old statements were being compared with newer information, and people who had once been overlooked were being reconsidered. But there was one thing that technology could not provide. It could not tell investigators why. That question remained. Why would anyone want to kill Sue Sharp? Why were John and Dana killed? Why was Tina taken from the cabin? And why were the younger boys left alive? The answer to those questions might reveal whether the murders were planned or spontaneous. It might reveal whether Sue had been targeted. It might explain the presence of multiple attackers. Or it might reveal that the crime began with something completely different. Investigators had to resist the temptation to decide too early. Because once a theory becomes fixed, every new piece of evidence can be interpreted to support it. That can be dangerous. A good investigation works in the opposite direction. It asks what the evidence actually says. Then it asks what explanations fit. The renewed investigation followed that approach as much as possible. And gradually, the old names returned. Martin Smart, John Babade, people connected to the Sharp family, people who had been around Ketty, people who had been questioned years earlier. Some were dead, some were still alive, some could be interviewed again, others could not. That created another painful limitation. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more witnesses disappear. A person who knew something in 1981 might have forgotten it by 2016. Another might have died. Another might have moved and become impossible to locate, and someone who had once been willing to talk might no longer want to. The passage of time was working against the investigators, but it was also working in their favor in one strange way. Modern technology had become better. DNA testing had improved. Forensic analysis had become more sensitive. Old evidence could sometimes be examined in ways that had not been possible when it was first collected. That meant a cold case could suddenly become warm again. A tiny trace could matter. A fragment of DNA could matter. A recorded voice could matter. A forgotten object could matter. The Ketty case had survived because evidence had survived, and the investigators were now trying to determine whether that evidence could finally speak. But there was another development that would make the case even more complicated. Investigators began revisiting the possibility that more than one person had been involved. The crime scene itself suggested that controlling multiple victims would have been difficult for a single person. The restraints, the violence, the movement inside the cabin, and the disappearance of Tina. All of these details created the possibility of multiple attackers. But again, possibility was not proof. The investigators needed to know whether there was evidence of more than one person. If there were multiple attackers, then the investigation had to identify their relationships. Did they know each other? Did they plan the crime together? Did one person recruit another? Or did several people become involved after the violence had already begun? These questions became increasingly important, because if there were multiple attackers, then one person's silence could protect another. A witness could become an accomplice could become a suspect, and a person who knew the truth could remain silent for decades. The possibility of multiple attackers also changed the way investigators looked at Tina. If she had been taken alive, someone had to decide what to do with her. Someone had to transport her. Someone had to know where she was going. And someone eventually left her remains in a remote location. That required another timeline, another journey, another set of decisions. The crime was becoming larger than the cabin itself. It stretched from Ketty into the surrounding region, and then eventually into the years that followed. But there was still one important thing missing: a definitive connection between the evidence and a specific person. The DNA clue was interesting. The hammer was interesting. The knife was interesting. The anonymous call was interesting. But investigators needed to put all of these pieces together. That was the challenge. A single clue can be misleading. Several independent clues pointing in the same direction are much harder to dismiss. And so investigators continued reviewing everything. They looked at the original reports. They examined photographs. They revisited statements. They studied the physical evidence. And they compared old information with new forensic results. The case had become a conversation between two generations of investigators. One generation had walked into Cabin 28 in 1981. Another was returning to the evidence decades later. Both were looking for the same thing, an answer. But perhaps the most haunting question was not about the killer. It was about Tina. For more than 3 years, her family did not know where she was. They had no grave, no certainty, no explanation. Only a missing child case connected to a brutal triple homicide. Then her remains were found. And even after that, the family still had no answer about who had taken her. For them, the case did not truly end in 1984. It continued, through every new lead, every new investigator, every new piece of evidence, every time someone claimed to know something. And every time the case seemed close to an answer, another question appeared. The renewed investigation offered something the original investigators had never had. Time. Not time in the sense of waiting. Time in the sense of technological advancement. More than 3 decades had passed. Forensic science had evolved dramatically. The investigators could now ask questions of evidence that had once been silent. And some of those questions finally produced results. But results are not always answers. Sometimes they simply point toward another mystery. That is exactly what happened. The evidence was beginning to point investigators toward people connected to the case. But the connection was not yet enough to tell the entire story. There was still no definitive reconstruction of that night. No complete explanation for Tina's disappearance. No confirmed motive. And no prosecution. The old case remained open. Yet something had changed. For the first time in decades, investigators had reason to believe that the physical evidence might still contain information capable of narrowing the field. And if that information could be connected with the old witness accounts, the timeline, and the people who had been around Cabin 28, the mystery might finally become smaller. The number of possible explanations might begin to shrink. The case had waited more than 30 years for that moment. Now investigators were following the evidence again, and the next step would take them back to one of the most troubling questions surrounding the original investigation. Who had a reason to hurt Sue Sharp? Because if investigators could understand the motive, they might finally understand the crime. And if they could understand the crime, they might finally understand what happened to Tina. The evidence had begun speaking, but it had not finished. And somewhere inside the old records was another clue that would make the investigation even more complicated. The renewed investigation had given detectives something they had not possessed in 1981. Time. Time to examine old evidence. Time to reconsider statements. And time to ask questions that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. But one question remained at the center of everything. Why? Why would someone enter cabin 28 and attack the people inside? Why were 4 people ultimately killed? And why was Tina Sharp taken away from the cabin? Without understanding the motive, investigators were left with a crime that seemed almost impossible to explain. There was no simple robbery. There was no obvious reason for someone to attack an entire family. And the violence appeared far beyond what would have been necessary for a simple confrontation. That made investigators look more closely at the relationships surrounding Sue Sharp. Sue had moved to Ketty with her children after separating from her husband. She was raising several children and trying to build a new life. To people outside the family, her life may have appeared ordinary. But investigators knew that ordinary lives can contain complicated relationships, arguments, breakups, old friendships, family problems, and people who know one another can sometimes carry grudges that outsiders never see. So investigators began looking backward. They wanted to know who had been angry with Sue, who had argued with her, who had visited the cabin, and whether anyone had ever threatened her. But this process created another danger. A person having an argument with someone does not mean they are capable of murder. A difficult relationship does not automatically become a motive for homicide. Investigators had to separate real evidence from assumptions. That was especially important in a case that had remained unsolved for decades. Every new theory could potentially change how people interpreted the old evidence. And some theories were more dramatic than the evidence could support. One possibility investigators considered was that Sue herself had been the intended target. If that was true, then perhaps John and Dana had become victims because they were present. Tina could have been killed because she witnessed the attack. The younger boys might have survived because they were in another part of the cabin. This theory could explain some aspects of the crime, but it created other questions. Why would the attackers need to restrain everyone? Why would the violence become so extreme? And why would Tina be taken away instead of simply being left behind? There was another possibility. Perhaps John or Dana had been the intended target. Their relationships were examined. Their movements were reconstructed. Investigators wanted to know who they had been spending time with. But there was no simple answer. The more investigators looked, the more the original crime seemed to involve several overlapping relationships. That was one of the reasons the case was so difficult. There was not one obvious suspect standing outside the circle. There were many people who might have known something, and some of them had reasons to avoid talking. Not necessarily because they were guilty. Sometimes people remain silent because they are afraid. Sometimes they do not want to become involved. Sometimes they believe they have nothing important to say. And sometimes they simply do not trust the police. In a case involving 4 deaths, however, silence can become extremely significant. Investigators continued looking at Martin Smart. Smart had lived close to the Sharp family. His stepson Justin had been friends with the Sharp children, and Smart had been in the area around the time of the murders. Then there was John Beau Babade. He had been staying with Smart. He also had a history that investigators wanted to understand. Neither man was convicted of the murders, but their names remained connected to the case for decades. One reason was the relationship between Smart and Sue Sharp. Later accounts of the case described tension between them, but exactly how much that tension mattered remains difficult to establish. A disagreement can be meaningful, or it can be completely unrelated to a murder. The investigators therefore needed more. They needed evidence showing that anger had turned into action. That meant looking at what happened before April 11th, 1981. Was there a specific argument? Was there a threat? Was someone afraid? Had Sue told anyone that she was worried? Had someone recently behaved strangely around the family? These were the kinds of details investigators hoped would reveal a motive. But the problem with old cases is that people often remember the past differently after they know what happened. A conversation that seemed meaningless in 1981 might appear suspicious after 4 people are murdered. That is why investigators had to compare memories with records wherever possible. They wanted contemporaneous evidence, something written down before the murders, something recorded before the case became famous, something that could establish what people actually knew at the time. The investigation also returned to the physical evidence. If a motive could not be established through testimony, perhaps the crime scene could provide another direction. The restraints were examined again. The weapons were examined. The tape was examined. And the possibility of multiple attackers remained. That possibility mattered because the crime appeared difficult for one person to carry out. Controlling several victims in a small cabin would have been complicated, especially if some victims resisted. If there were 2 or more attackers, however, the situation would become easier to understand. One person could control one victim, while another controlled someone else. But again, investigators needed evidence. A theory about multiple attackers could not become a fact simply because it seemed logical. And there was another major question. If there had been multiple attackers, why had nobody in the surrounding community heard enough to intervene? Cabin 28 was surrounded by other cabins. Noise could potentially travel. But the night was quiet, and the attackers appeared to have enough time to leave before anyone realized what had happened. That suggested one of several possibilities. Perhaps the attack was quieter than investigators imagined. Perhaps the victims were restrained before the violence began. Perhaps the attackers were known to the victims. Or perhaps the people nearby simply did not realize anything was wrong. There was no definitive answer, and every possibility had weaknesses. That was becoming a familiar pattern. The investigation could explain one detail, but another detail would remain unexplained. Meanwhile, Tina's death continued to complicate the story. Her remains had been found far from Ketty. That meant her disappearance was not simply an unexplained absence. Someone had taken her, or she had somehow traveled far away, and she ultimately died. Investigators needed to understand whether her death happened immediately after the murders or later. They also needed to know whether she had been alive for some period after leaving Cabin 28. If she had survived the initial attack, she might have known who was responsible. That possibility was deeply disturbing. It would mean the person who took Tina may have known that she could identify them, and that could potentially explain why she disappeared. But there was no definitive proof. Her remains could not provide every answer investigators wanted. The passage of time had erased some of the information. Still, the location where she was found mattered. Someone had left her there. Someone knew where that place was, and someone had access to the means of transporting her there. Those facts narrowed the possibilities. The investigation, therefore, became a search for connections. Who had vehicles? Who knew the roads? Who knew Tina? Who knew the Sharp family? Who had a reason to be in Ketty that night? And who might have been able to leave the area without attracting attention? The answers began forming a complicated network. Some people were connected by friendship, some through family, some through work, and some through the local community. But none of those connections alone solved the murders. Then investigators returned to one of the strangest pieces of evidence: the anonymous telephone call. Someone had contacted authorities after Tina's remains were found. The caller knew about the case, and investigators later preserved the recording. The question became whether the caller was simply a person following the news or someone with inside knowledge. If the caller had been connected to the crime, then the voice might contain information that could reveal something about Tina. But if the caller was merely a member of the public, the recording might lead nowhere. Still, investigators had to examine it. That was the philosophy of the renewed investigation. Nothing should be dismissed simply because it was old. A clue could become valuable decades later. The same was true of the letter associated with Martin Smart. Its wording had attracted attention because it referred to 4 people's lives. That number was impossible to overlook. There had been 4 victims, but the meaning of the letter was not established. It was not a courtroom confession. It was not enough to prove that Smart had committed the murders. and Smart was never convicted. Yet the letter became part of the mystery surrounding the case. Investigators and researchers would continue asking what it meant. Was it connected to the murders? Was it referring to something else? Was it written in a moment of anger? Or was it a clue to something much darker? Without the full context, there was no certain answer. This was the problem with so much of the Keddy case. The clues were real, but their meaning was often uncertain. The renewed investigation therefore required patience. Investigators could not simply choose the theory they liked most. They had to test it, and as they did, the physical evidence became increasingly important. The DNA evidence from the tape was one example. The hammer was another. The knife was another. Each object could potentially provide a connection, and modern forensic science offered possibilities that did not exist in 1981. But forensic evidence also had limitations. A DNA profile might establish contact. It might identify a person, but it might not explain when the contact happened. A weapon might match the description of an object associated with a suspect, but that did not necessarily prove that the object was used in the murder. Investigators had to build a chain strong enough to connect the evidence to the crime, and then to a person. That chain was still incomplete, but the renewed investigation was making progress. The case had once been almost completely frozen. Now it was active again, and that alone mattered, because the victims had never received justice. Their families had lived with unanswered questions, and Tina's disappearance had left another wound. For years, people had wondered whether she might somehow be alive. Then her remains were discovered. The hope ended, but the mystery did not. In some ways, the discovery made the case even more difficult. Now there were 4 victims, 4 lives ended, 4 families affected, and one unanswered question. Who did it? Investigators were getting closer to understanding the relationships around Cabin 28. But the motive remained uncertain, and perhaps the most disturbing possibility was that the murders were not random at all. If the crime had been planned, then the attacker, or attackers, may have known exactly where they were going. They may have known who would be inside. They may have known how to enter, and they may have known how to leave. That would mean Cabin 28 was not chosen by accident. It was selected, and if that was true, then someone had made a decision before arriving. Someone had decided that 4 lives would be destroyed. That possibility changed the way investigators looked at everything. A planned attack requires preparation. Preparation requires time. And time creates opportunities for witnesses. Someone may have seen a vehicle. Someone may have heard an argument. Someone may have noticed a person behaving strangely. Someone may have seen Tina after the murders. The problem was finding that person, and that was where the investigation would eventually encounter one of its most difficult obstacles. People who might have known something were no longer available. Some had died. Some had moved, some had forgotten, and some may never have spoken. The case was therefore becoming a battle between evidence and time. The evidence had survived, but the people who could explain it were disappearing. Still, investigators refused to let the case completely disappear. The murders remained open, the old evidence remained, and the names remained. Martin Smart, John Bobade, the people around Cabin 28, the people who had known the victims, and the people who might have seen something that night. The question of motive was still unresolved, but investigators were beginning to understand something else. The answer might not be found in one clue. It might require several clues to line up. A DNA profile, a weapon, a statement, a timeline, a relationship, a missing child, a distant burial site, and perhaps one forgotten detail from the night itself. The Keddy murders were not a single mystery. There were several mysteries connected together, and solving one could potentially unlock another. The next breakthrough would not come from a dramatic confession. It would come from something much quieter, a piece of evidence that had been sitting for years. And when investigators looked at it again, they discovered that modern science might be able to reveal something hidden in the original crime scene, something that could potentially tell them who had been there. And that was when the old case began moving closer to a name. Not a conviction, not yet, but a name. A person who had once been connected to the evidence. A person whose relationship to the crime would become one of the most closely examined aspects of the renewed investigation. And once that connection was understood, investigators would have to confront an uncomfortable question. Had the original investigation been looking in the right direction all along? The answer remained uncertain, but the evidence was beginning to point somewhere, and after decades of silence, that was enough to keep the investigation alive. The Ketty murders had already survived more than 3 decades. The cabin was no longer the center of a busy investigation. The original witnesses had grown older. Some had moved away, some had died, and some of the people investigators once questioned were no longer alive to answer anything. Yet the case had never truly disappeared. It remained in old reports, in photographs, in evidence boxes, and in the memories of the families who had spent decades wondering what really happened. By the time investigators returned to the case, the world around Ketty had changed. But the questions had not. Who entered cabin 28? Who attacked the people inside? Who took Tina? And why? The renewed investigation had already produced several interesting pieces of evidence. But investigators needed more than interesting evidence. They needed connections. One of the most important things about a cold case is that every new discovery has to be compared with what was already known. A clue that seems important by itself may become meaningless when placed against the full timeline. But sometimes the opposite happens. A small clue can suddenly make an old piece of evidence important again. That was exactly what investigators were trying to determine. The old crime scene had contained biological evidence. At the time, forensic technology was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. DNA testing was not yet the powerful investigative tool it would later become. So material collected in 1981 could sit for years without revealing its full value. Then science changed. Testing became more sensitive. Investigators could revisit old samples, and suddenly, evidence that had once been almost silent could potentially provide information. But the process was not simple. A sample had to survive. It had to be properly preserved, and there had to be enough usable material left for testing. Even then, the result had to be interpreted carefully. The investigators could not simply look at a DNA result and declare that the case was solved. They had to ask what the result actually meant. Was the material deposited during the murders? Could it have been left there earlier? Could the person have had an innocent reason to touch the object? And could the DNA be connected to other evidence? Those questions were especially important because Cabin 28 had not been an isolated laboratory. It had been a home. People lived there. People touched things. Family members came and went. Friends visited. Objects were handled. That meant investigators needed context. The presence of someone's DNA did not automatically mean that person was the killer. The timing and circumstances mattered. This was why investigators continued examining the entire case rather than focusing on one result. The renewed investigation also brought attention back to the people who had lived around the Sharp family. One of them was Martin Smart. Smart's connection to the case had never completely disappeared. His stepson had been close to the Sharp children. His home was nearby, and his name had appeared repeatedly in discussions surrounding the murders. But again, suspicion was not proof. Smart was never convicted of the murders. Neither was John Babade. And because both men eventually died, investigators could no longer bring them in for a new interview. That created a problem. If a person is alive, investigators can confront them with new evidence. They can ask about inconsistencies. They can ask why their story changed. They can compare their answers with new information. But when a person is dead, that opportunity is gone. The evidence has to speak for itself. That was particularly important with Smart. Over the years, statements associated with him became part of the larger mystery. Some were suspicious, some were ambiguous, and some were interpreted differently by different people. The challenge was determining which details could actually be verified. One of the most discussed pieces of information was a letter connected to Smart. The wording referred to 4 people's lives. Because the murders had involved 4 victims, the reference attracted attention. But the letter was not a confession. There was no court ruling establishing that Smart wrote it as an admission of the murders. And without the complete context, it could not provide a definitive explanation. It remained a troubling piece of the puzzle. Nothing more, nothing less. The same caution applied to the hammer discovered years later. It was found in a pond near Ketty in 2016. The object reportedly resembled a hammer Smart had previously said was missing. For investigators, the discovery was worth examining. But resemblance alone could not establish that the hammer was the murder weapon. The object had been exposed to the environment for years. It could have belonged to anyone. And even if it had once belonged to Smart, that still would not automatically prove that he had used it. Investigators needed forensic evidence. They needed a connection to the crime scene. They needed something that could survive scrutiny. This was the difference between a suspicion and an investigation. The renewed case was not simply about finding a person who seemed suspicious. It was about finding evidence that could withstand questions. And that process led investigators back to the physical evidence from Cabin 28. One item in particular remained important: the tape. The victims had been restrained. Tape had been used. And decades later, investigators were able to examine biological material associated with the evidence. The possibility of DNA changed the investigation, because unlike a witness statement, DNA does not depend on someone's memory of an event. But DNA still has limitations. It can tell investigators that biological material is present. It can sometimes identify whose biological material it is. But it does not always tell investigators exactly when or how that material arrived there. So investigators had to ask a larger question. Could the DNA be connected to the events of April 11, 1981? If yes, that would be important. If no, it might be little more than a coincidence. The case therefore became a careful process of comparison. The evidence was compared against known information. Old statements were examined. The timeline was reviewed. And investigators looked for inconsistencies. One of the most important aspects of a murder investigation is timing. A person might have a reason to commit a crime. They might have access to the victims. They might even have suspicious evidence connected to them. But if they were physically somewhere else when the crime occurred, the theory can collapse. That is why investigators wanted to reconstruct the night as precisely as possible. Who was at the bar? Who returned home? Who was seen around Cabin 28? Who had access to a vehicle? Who could have left Ketty without being noticed? And most importantly, who could have been absent long enough to commit the murders? The answers were incomplete, but investigators were slowly creating a timeline. The timeline also brought attention to the surviving children. They were among the most important witnesses in the case. But they were also children. That meant their memories had to be treated carefully. A young child who experiences something terrifying may remember fragments. A face, a voice, a movement, a piece of clothing, a sound, but not necessarily the entire sequence. And decades later, those memories could be even harder to interpret. One of the surviving boys had reportedly been sleeping in another room. That meant he might not have seen the attack, but he may have heard something. Another surviving child had been in the living room area. What they remembered could potentially help establish what happened before the murders. Yet investigators also had to consider the effect of trauma. Memory does not work like a video recording. People do not always remember events exactly as they happened. They remember pieces. Sometimes those pieces are extremely accurate. Sometimes they are incomplete. And sometimes later conversations can influence how those memories are recalled. That did not make the surviving children unreliable. It meant investigators had to handle their statements carefully. The same principle applied to every witness. A person might genuinely believe something happened one way, but investigators still needed independent evidence. The renewed investigation was therefore becoming a search for independent confirmation. If a witness remembered a particular vehicle, could another witness confirm it? If someone remembered a person being present, was there another record showing that person was nearby? If a letter contained a strange statement, could other evidence support its meaning? If DNA appeared on the tape, could other evidence place the same person near Cabin 28? The stronger the overlap, the more meaningful the evidence became. And slowly, the case began to narrow. But then investigators faced another problem. The Ketty murders had generated so many theories that it became difficult to separate original evidence from later speculation. Over the decades, stories had circulated. Some claimed the murders were connected to drugs. Others focused on personal relationships. Some suggested a revenge motive. Others suggested the crime was the result of a confrontation that became violent. And some theories were based almost entirely on assumptions. Investigators could not treat all of these equally. They had to return to the original evidence. What was actually known? For people had been killed. Tina had disappeared. Her remains were later discovered. The crime scene showed signs of restraint. There was evidence of severe violence. There were no simple answers. Everything else had to be tested against those facts. That was one reason the investigation remained difficult even decades later. The crime had too many possible explanations, and too little definitive evidence. Yet one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Whoever was responsible had left behind more than one clue. The evidence was not limited to the crime scene. There were witnesses, vehicles, relationships, statements, objects, and biological material. The task was to connect them. Then came another important consideration. What if the person responsible had known the family? That would explain how someone could enter the cabin without immediately creating suspicion. It could explain why the victims might not have reacted immediately. And it could potentially explain how the attacker knew the layout of the cabin. But once again, that was only a possibility. A stranger could also enter a home, especially if the door was unlocked, or if someone inside opened it. There was no simple answer, and that uncertainty continued to haunt investigators. Still, the renewed case had achieved something important. It had changed the question. The original investigation had largely asked, who could have done this? The new investigation was asking, what evidence can prove who was there? That was a much more precise question, and it allowed investigators to work backward. Instead of beginning with a suspect and trying to prove the theory, they could begin with the evidence and follow it toward the suspect. That distinction mattered, because it reduced the risk of becoming trapped by an old theory. And the more investigators examined the evidence, the more they realized that some of the most important answers might have been hidden in material collected during the original investigation. Material that had waited quietly for decades. One such piece of evidence was the medical tape. The biological material recovered from it became particularly interesting. But even if the DNA belonged to someone connected to the case, investigators still needed to know how that person became connected to the tape. The tape itself had a history. It had been handled. It had been used. And eventually it had been collected. Every step mattered. The question was not simply, whose DNA is this? The question was, why is this person's DNA here? That was the question investigators had to answer before the evidence could become truly powerful. And there was another clue waiting in the background. The anonymous call, a voice preserved from the past. Someone had contacted authorities. Someone knew something. But who? Could modern voice analysis identify the caller? Could the caller's identity be connected to the people surrounding Cabin 28? And if the caller had been connected to the murders, why had they waited so long? Fear? Guilt? A desire to confess? Or simply an attempt to create confusion? There was no way to know without identifying the person. And so the recording became another piece of evidence waiting for modern technology. The investigation was now moving in several directions at once. DNA, weapons, the anonymous call, old statements, and the people who had been around Ketty. Every path seemed to lead back to the same night, April 11th, 1981, a normal evening that ended in a crime that would remain unexplained for decades. The families had waited, investigators had waited, and the evidence had waited, but the case was not finished, because the next stage of the investigation would involve one of the most difficult tasks in any cold case: reconstructing the final hours before the murders. If investigators could establish who was where, when they were there, and when they left, then some of the theories would become impossible. Others would become stronger, and one particular timeline would begin attracting attention. A timeline involving the people closest to Cabin 28, the people who knew the family, the people who could move around Ketty without looking out of place, and the people whose stories would need to be compared one more time. The answers were still hidden, but the investigation had finally begun to move. And somewhere between the old statements and the new forensic evidence was the possibility of discovering what happened during those final hours. The question was no longer simply whether the truth had survived. It had. The question was whether investigators could finally recognize it. The most important part of any murder investigation is often the period immediately before the crime. What were the victims doing? Who had seen them? Who had spoken to them? And who could account for their own movements? In Ketty, those questions were especially important because the murders happened inside a small community where people knew one another. The night of April 11th, 1981, had begun normally. There was no indication that the Sharp family was about to become the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in California. Sue Sharp was at home with her children. Her daughter Sheila was away with friends. The younger children were around the cabin, and John Sharp and Dana Wingate were also connected to the cabin that evening. Nothing about the evening initially suggested that anything extraordinary was about to happen, but sometime during those final hours, the situation changed. Investigators later had to reconstruct those hours from memories, statements, and physical evidence. The problem was that there was no perfect record. No camera had captured everyone entering and leaving. No phone recording had preserved every conversation, and no witness had seen the entire night from beginning to end. Instead, investigators had fragments. One person remembered seeing someone. Another remembered hearing something. Someone else remembered being somewhere else. And investigators had to fit those pieces together. That is where a cold case can become almost like a puzzle. Except the pieces do not come with instructions. Some pieces are missing. Some may have been damaged by time, and some may have been placed in the wrong position years earlier. Still, investigators began with what they knew. Sue was inside cabin 28. John was there. Dana was there. The younger children were nearby. And later, 3 victims would be found inside the cabin. Tina would be missing. The question was how the transition happened. At some point, someone entered the cabin, or someone already inside became violent. Either way, the situation escalated. The victims were restrained. Violence followed, and by the time the attack was over, the cabin had become a crime scene. But the attacker, or attackers, were gone. That meant the final hours were more important than ever. Investigators needed to establish the last confirmed sightings. They wanted to know when each person was last seen alive. They wanted to know who had been with them. And they wanted to know which people could be eliminated based on their movements. The surviving children were among the most important pieces of that timeline. They were alive. They were inside the cabin. And they had experienced something that no one else could completely describe. But because they were children, investigators had to be careful. Their memories could provide valuable information. At the same time, the investigators had to avoid putting words into their mouths. A question asked incorrectly can change a child's answer. And once a particular detail enters a witness's memory, it can become difficult to determine whether it came from the original event or from later conversations. So investigators had to separate what the children remembered themselves from what they learned later. That distinction mattered, especially when it came to descriptions of the people who might have been inside the cabin. Over the years, various accounts of possible suspects emerged. Some descriptions were vague, some were based on memories that had changed, and some were never independently confirmed. That made the investigation extremely difficult. But one fact remained. Someone had been inside cabin 28, and that person had left. The question was how. Ketty was a small community. Someone leaving a cabin late at night might have been noticed. A vehicle could have been noticed. Footsteps could have been heard. A person walking through the area might have crossed paths with another resident. Yet nobody came forward with a complete account of the killer leaving the cabin. That suggested several possibilities. Perhaps the attacker left quietly. Perhaps the person was familiar enough with the area that nobody found their presence suspicious. Perhaps the attack happened later than investigators initially believed. Or perhaps someone saw something, but did not understand its significance until much later. There was another possibility. The attacker may have known the victims. If someone familiar entered cabin 28, the victims might not have immediately felt threatened. A stranger arriving late at night could have triggered suspicion. A familiar person might not. This theory was one reason investigators continued examining the relationships surrounding the Sharp family. But again, knowing someone does not make a person guilty. People visit neighbors. Friends stop by. Families argue. And most arguments do not end in murder. Investigators needed something more. They needed a reason, a connection, and evidence that brought them back to Martin Smart. Smart lived nearby. His stepson knew the Sharp children, and Smart was familiar with the area. His presence in the larger story therefore continued to attract attention. John Babade was also connected to Smart. He had been staying with him, and because both men were around Ketty during the relevant period, investigators examined their movements. But neither man was convicted. That distinction has remained important. The case has generated many claims over the years, but no court has established who murdered the victims. The official mystery therefore remained. The investigators could suspect, they could theorize, they could examine, but they could not close the case without enough evidence, and that evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. One of the most important unanswered questions concerned Tina. If she had been taken from cabin 28, when exactly did that happen? Was she alive when she left? Who took her? Was she transported immediately? Or did something happen later? The distance between Ketty and where Tina's remains were eventually discovered created another problem. Whoever moved her had to travel. That meant the person had access to transportation or another means of getting there. And if someone drove Tina away, investigators had to consider whether anyone could have seen the vehicle. A road trip in 1981 was different from one today. There were fewer cameras, no smartphones, no digital location histories, no automated license plate systems recording every movement. A person could travel a considerable distance without leaving a digital trail. That was both an advantage for a criminal and a nightmare for investigators. The lack of technology meant that investigators depended heavily on people. People's memories, people's honesty, people's willingness to speak. And sometimes people simply did not remember. This was especially true decades later. A person might remember that they went to a bar, but not exactly what time they left. They might remember seeing a vehicle, but not its license plate. They might remember a conversation, but not the exact words. And in a murder investigation, a few minutes can matter. The investigators therefore tried to establish a sequence. Who was where? When? And for how long? The more they reconstructed the evening, the more they could compare the accounts. If someone said they were somewhere at a particular time, could another person confirm it? If someone said they never left a location, was there evidence that contradicted that? If a vehicle was reportedly seen, who could have been driving it? Every answer could either strengthen or weaken a theory. And slowly, the investigators began narrowing the possibilities. But then there was the physical crime scene itself. The victims had been restrained. That detail suggested that the attacker had some degree of control. The violence was not simply a single moment. The victims were tied. They were attacked. And someone had enough time to carry out those actions. This created another question. Why did nobody nearby intervene? Perhaps the cabin was quiet. Perhaps the victims were unable to scream. Perhaps the attackers threatened them. Perhaps the neighbors heard nothing unusual. Or perhaps the violence happened so quickly that there was no opportunity for anyone to respond. Again, investigators could not know for certain, but they could compare each possibility with the physical evidence. The scene suggested that the attacker had been inside long enough to control the victims. That was important. It meant the crime was not necessarily a sudden confrontation that lasted only a few seconds. Something had happened inside that cabin, something that investigators could only reconstruct from what remained afterward. The surviving children were especially important because their survival meant that someone had made a decision not to kill them. That decision was significant. If the attacker wanted to eliminate every witness, the younger boys could have been victims too. But they were not. Why? Perhaps the attacker did not know they were there. Perhaps they were asleep. Perhaps they were hidden. Perhaps the attacker did not want to hurt children. Or perhaps the attacker believed they were too young to understand what they had witnessed. No answer was proven, but the fact remained. The surviving children became living links to that night. They carried memories that investigators hoped might eventually help explain what happened. And for the families, those memories were not simply evidence. They were part of a childhood that had been permanently altered. The case therefore carried another emotional weight. The victims were not simply names in a police file. They had families. They had friends. They had ordinary lives. And their final hours were the last moments of those lives. For Sue, it was the last evening with her children. For John, it was the final night of his life. For Dana, it was the end of a life that had barely begun. And for Tina, it was the beginning of a disappearance that would continue for years. The investigators had to reconstruct those hours without knowing exactly where the story would lead. And perhaps the most disturbing part was that the killer had already had a head start. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the person responsible could have been miles away. The investigation also had to account for the possibility that the killer had received help. If multiple people were involved, then the crime could have required coordination. One person could restrain, another could attack, another could transport Tina, and afterward, everyone would have to remain silent. That was a difficult scenario to prove, but it could explain certain aspects of the crime. Again, investigators needed evidence. They could not simply count the number of victims and assume multiple attackers. The physical evidence had to support it, and the evidence was being examined again. Modern technology offered investigators something the original case had lacked: the ability to search tiny traces, the ability to compare DNA, the ability to examine old material with new methods, the ability to revisit evidence that had once been considered insignificant. This was the reason the case had not been abandoned, because even after 35 years, there was still a possibility that the killer had left something behind, and one piece of evidence in particular remained important: the tape. It had been used during the attack, and investigators were able to obtain biological material from it. That biological material produced a DNA profile. The result attracted attention because it could potentially connect someone to the crime scene. But again, investigators had to be cautious. A DNA profile does not automatically explain an entire murder. It provides a lead. The lead must then be tested against other evidence. And that was what investigators began doing. They compared the result with people connected to the case. They examined old suspects. They looked at the timeline, and they asked whether the person connected to the DNA could have physically been in cabin 28 during the murders. If the answer was no, the DNA would have to be explained another way. If the answer was yes, it would become more significant. That was how the renewed investigation worked. One step at a time, one clue at a time. No dramatic conclusion, no easy answer, just evidence. And as investigators worked through the old case, the story of the final hours became increasingly complicated. The people who were supposed to be somewhere else had to be checked. The people who claimed they had seen nothing had to be reconsidered. The people who had been close to the family had to be examined. And the people who were no longer alive could only be evaluated through the evidence they had left behind. The investigation was no longer simply about what happened in 1981. It was also about what people had said afterward. Because sometimes a person reveals more through what they do after a crime than through what they say before it. A strange statement, an unexplained movement, a sudden departure, a change in behavior. None of these things proves murder, but together they can become important. Investigators began looking for those inconsistencies, and that process brought them back to one of the most troubling details: the missing hammer. Smart had reportedly said a hammer was missing. Years later, a hammer was found in a pond near Ketty. The object was examined. Could it be the same hammer? Could it have been used during the attack? Could it contain evidence? Or was its presence simply another coincidence? The answers were not immediate, but investigators were willing to consider the possibility, because cold cases often depend on patience. An object that seemed meaningless for decades can suddenly become important when another clue appears. The same was true of the tape. The same was true of the anonymous call, and the same could be true of the old statements. The investigation was essentially rebuilding the case from the ground up. Not because investigators had forgotten the old case, but because they now had tools that did not exist when it began. And somewhere inside those old pieces was the possibility of a complete story. The story of a family, a cabin, a night that started normally, and a crime that ended 4 lives. But there was still one question that refused to disappear. What happened to Tina after she left cabin 28? Because even if investigators eventually understood who attacked the others, Tina's disappearance required another explanation. Someone had to take her. Someone had to transport her. Someone had to leave her remains. And if she survived the initial attack, someone had to keep her alive for at least some period of time. That meant the person responsible for Tina's death might have known something about the other murders. Or perhaps the events were connected in a way investigators had not yet understood. Either way, Tina remained the key to the larger mystery. Her story connected the cabin to the remote location where her remains were found. And that connection could potentially lead investigators away from Ketty, toward another person, another place, another vehicle, another secret. The case was beginning to stretch beyond the cabin. And as investigators followed that trail, they would eventually discover that one of the most important questions was not simply who had been inside cabin 28. It was who had the opportunity to leave Ketty without being noticed. Because somewhere between the cabin and the place where Tina was found, there was a journey. And that journey had to have been made by someone. Someone who knew where they were going. Someone who knew how to get there. And someone who had every reason to keep quiet. The trail had survived. The evidence had survived. And after decades, investigators were finally following it again. But the next clue would lead them into one of the darkest parts of the case. The story of what happened after the murders. The cabin was only the beginning. For investigators, one of the most difficult parts of the case was understanding what happened after the violence inside cabin 28. The 3 victims found inside the cabin could be examined at the crime scene. But Tina was different. She was gone. Her absence created an entirely separate mystery. Somewhere between the time the attack began and the moment investigators arrived, Tina had disappeared. And unlike the others, her story continued beyond Ketty. For more than 3 years, nobody knew where she was. Her family had no grave to visit, no confirmed explanation, no certainty about whether she was alive or dead. There was only one terrible possibility after another. But eventually, in 1984, Tina's remains were discovered in Butte County, roughly 60 miles from Ketty. The discovery finally answered one question. Tina was dead, but it created several more. Who had taken her? When had she died? And how had she traveled so far from the cabin? Those questions became central to the investigation. Because if Tina had been taken from cabin 28 on the night of the murders, then whoever removed her had managed to leave the area without immediately being caught. That meant the person had either planned the escape or reacted quickly after the killings. Either possibility was disturbing. A person who planned the crime would have had to think about what would happen afterward. A person who acted spontaneously would somehow have had to make decisions quickly enough to avoid detection. And there was another issue: the distance. Ketty was surrounded by forest and winding roads. Someone familiar with the region could travel through the area without necessarily attracting attention. In 1981, there were no smartphones tracking movements, no network of cameras covering every road, no digital maps recording where a person had been. A vehicle could leave Ketty and disappear into the surrounding roads. That made the task of reconstructing Tina's final journey incredibly difficult. Investigators had to rely on witnesses, and witnesses had to remember. Someone might have seen a vehicle. Someone might have seen a person. Someone might have noticed something unusual. But the challenge was knowing whether those memories were connected to the crime. A vehicle traveling through the area could be completely innocent. A stranger could simply be passing through. A person walking near a road might have nothing to do with Tina. Investigators had to be careful. They could not turn every ordinary event into evidence. Still, Tina's disappearance meant that transportation was an unavoidable part of the investigation. Somebody had to get her from Ketty to the place where she was eventually found. And that person had to know enough about the area, or have enough time, to reach a remote location. The location itself was significant. It was not simply outside the cabin. It was far enough away that investigators had to consider whether Tina had been deliberately moved. If she had been left close to Ketty, perhaps her body might have been discovered much earlier. Instead, years passed. Her remains remained hidden, and the family continued searching for answers. For Tina's mother and siblings, the uncertainty must have been its own kind of suffering. There was no final goodbye, no certainty, no way to know whether Tina was frightened, whether she was alone, or whether someone had been with her during those final moments. Then the discovery came, and the family finally knew. But knowing that Tina was dead was not the same as knowing who killed her. The investigation continued, and as investigators revisited the case decades later, they began examining the connection between Tina's disappearance and the other evidence. One possibility was that Tina had witnessed the murders. If so, she could have become a dangerous witness. She might have known what the attackers looked like, She might have recognized a voice. She might have known someone who entered the cabin. That could explain why she disappeared. But again, there was no definitive proof that this was the reason. Another possibility was that Tina had simply been caught in the middle of a crime directed at someone else. Perhaps the attackers had not originally intended to harm her. Perhaps she was taken afterward for another reason. Perhaps the events inside the cabin changed unexpectedly. The evidence could not provide a complete answer, and that uncertainty was one of the reasons the Ketty case remained so haunting. The murders did not seem to follow a simple pattern. There were too many people, too many actions, too many unanswered questions, and one child who vanished. Investigators also had to consider whether the people responsible had help after leaving the cabin. Moving a person from one location to another requires time. If Tina was transported by vehicle, someone had to drive. If more than one person was involved, someone had to know what was happening. And if the person responsible acted alone, they still had to manage the journey without being discovered. Every possibility created another question. Who had access to a vehicle? Who knew the roads? Who could leave Ketty that night? And who had an unexplained gap in their timeline? Those questions brought investigators back to the people who lived nearby. They were familiar with the area. They knew the roads. They knew the community. And if someone wanted to leave without attracting attention, being a local could actually make that easier. But that did not mean a local person was responsible. Again, investigators needed evidence, and the evidence had to connect the person to Tina. That was difficult. Tina's remains had been found years later. Whatever happened between Ketty and the discovery site had occurred long before modern investigators arrived. Time had erased some information. Weather had erased more. And there were no digital records to follow. The case depended on what had survived. That included the physical evidence from Cabin 28, the restraints, the tape, the weapons, the photographs, the reports, and the memories of people who had been there. Modern investigators began looking at these pieces together. One of the most interesting developments involved the tape. Biological material recovered from the tape produced a DNA profile. That profile became a potential investigative lead. But investigators still needed to determine how it connected to the crime. If the person whose DNA was found had been inside Cabin 28, that would be significant. But if there was an innocent explanation, the clue would have to be interpreted differently. The investigators therefore looked for corroboration. Could the same person be connected to the area? Could the timeline place them near the cabin? Could other evidence support the connection? Could the person be connected to Tina's disappearance? That was the real question. One clue could be coincidence. Several independent clues pointing in the same direction were much harder to dismiss. The renewed investigation, therefore, became increasingly focused on connections. A person, a location, a vehicle, a piece of evidence, a statement, a timeline. If those pieces could be connected, the case might finally become understandable. But there was another obstacle. The people who might have known what happened were no longer available. Martin Smart had died. John Babade had died. Other witnesses had aged. Some had moved, and some memories had faded. The investigators could not simply go back to April 1981 and ask everyone again. They had to work with what remained. That made the evidence from the original investigation even more valuable. Every photograph mattered. Every report mattered. Every recorded statement mattered. Even an object that looked ordinary could potentially become important. That was why the hammer found in 2016 attracted attention. It was recovered from a pond near Ketty. Investigators noted its similarity to a hammer that Smart had previously reported missing. The discovery was intriguing, but intriguing was not enough. The hammer had to be tested. If it could be connected to the murders, it might become important. If it could not, then it would remain another unanswered possibility. That was how the investigation proceeded. One object at a time, one test at a time, and the longer investigators worked, the more obvious the central problem became. The crime was old, but the evidence was not necessarily useless. Old evidence could still contain DNA. Old recordings could still contain voices. Old statements could still reveal inconsistencies. Old objects could still contain traces. And sometimes the truth hides in a place nobody thought to examine carefully enough. That possibility kept the case alive. The families wanted answers. Investigators wanted answers. And the public continued to wonder. But there was another question that received less attention. What happened to the surviving children? They had lived through the aftermath. They had lost their mother. They had lost their siblings. And they had been left with memories of a night they could never completely explain. For them, the case was not an interesting mystery. It was their childhood, a part of their lives permanently connected to a cabin in Ketty. As the years passed, those children became adults. Their memories changed with them, and their understanding of what had happened also changed. But one thing remained. They knew that someone had entered the cabin. They knew that people they loved had died, and they knew that Tina had disappeared. That made their memories incredibly important. Yet investigators had to be careful not to allow later theories to influence those memories. The question was always, what did they remember before they heard everyone else's theories? That distinction could make a huge difference. Because once a person hears a theory repeatedly, it can become difficult to separate memory from information. The investigators, therefore, had to compare old statements with later ones. If a detail appeared in an early statement, it could be particularly important. If it appeared only decades later, investigators had to consider whether something had influenced the memory. This was not an accusation against the witnesses. It was simply the reality of human memory, and that reality made the case even harder. Meanwhile, Tina's final journey remained almost completely unknown. The place where she was found could tell investigators where her story ended. It could not automatically tell them where it began. They had to trace backward, from the discovery site, to the roads, to the surrounding communities, to Ketty, and finally to Cabin 28. The further they traveled backward, the more uncertainty they encountered. But they continued, because somewhere along that route was a person who knew what happened. Perhaps that person had already been questioned. Perhaps they had already told investigators everything they claimed to know. Perhaps they had never been considered important. Or perhaps they had been hiding something. There was no way to know without examining the evidence again. And that was exactly what the renewed investigation was doing. The old case was being reconstructed from the beginning, not based on rumor, not based on internet theories, but based on evidence. That process also forced investigators to confront another possibility. What if the person responsible was not one of the names everyone had focused on for decades? What if the killer had never been publicly identified? What if the real answer was somewhere outside the most familiar theories? That possibility had to remain open, because a cold case can become dangerous when everyone becomes convinced they already know the answer. The goal was not to prove an old theory. The goal was to find the truth, and the truth might lead somewhere unexpected. The evidence from the tape could lead somewhere. The hammer could lead somewhere. The anonymous call could lead somewhere. And Tina's journey could lead somewhere. The challenge was determining whether all of those paths eventually met. If they did, the case could finally become clear. But if they led in different directions, investigators would have to decide which clues were meaningful and which were simply coincidences. There was another piece of the puzzle that remained particularly disturbing. The person who took Tina had managed to keep her location secret for years. That suggested either extraordinary luck or deliberate concealment. The place where she was found was remote enough that the remains were not immediately discovered. That meant whoever left her there may have believed the location would remain hidden. But people make mistakes. They leave traces. They tell someone. They remember something. And sometimes those mistakes survive longer than the person who made them. That was the hope of the renewed investigation. Somewhere in the surviving evidence, the killer may have made a mistake. A biological trace. A statement. A forgotten object. A contradiction. Something. And if investigators could find it, they might finally connect the past to the present. The Ketty murders had begun with a family living quietly in a small California community. They had ended with 4 people dead and a child missing. Then the story had stretched across decades. The family had waited. The investigation had stalled. Tina's remains had eventually been found. And finally, modern investigators returned to the evidence. The trail had never completely disappeared. It had simply become harder to see. But now investigators were looking with different tools. Different technology, different questions, and perhaps the most important difference of all. They knew what they were searching for. A connection, a person, a reason, and proof. The next stage of the investigation would bring attention back to the evidence inside cabin 28. Because while Tina's journey was important, the answer to that journey might still be waiting at the place where everything began. The cabin, the tape, the weapons, the traces left behind, and the small details that investigators had once been unable to understand. After more than 30 years, those details were finally being examined again, and one of them would raise a possibility that investigators could not easily dismiss. A possibility that the person responsible had left behind something far more revealing than anyone realized. Something that could potentially connect the crime scene to a name. And if that connection was real, the Ketty mystery might finally be moving toward its most important question yet. Who was the person whose evidence had survived all those years? For more than 30 years, the Ketty murders remained trapped between two worlds. In one world, there were memories. People remembered the night. They remembered the cabin. They remembered the victims. And they remembered the questions that followed. In the other world, there was evidence. Objects collected from the scene. Photographs. Old reports. Biological material. And details that had survived long after the people connected to them had disappeared from the story. The challenge was bringing those two worlds together. By the time investigators revisited the case, forensic science had changed dramatically. Evidence that had been almost impossible to analyze in 1981 could now potentially reveal information. But modern technology did not automatically solve old crimes. It simply gave investigators another opportunity to ask the evidence questions that could not be answered decades earlier. And one of the most important questions was about the biological material associated with the tape used to restrain the victims. The tape had been inside cabin 28. It had been handled during the attack, and investigators hoped that something had remained on it. A microscopic trace, something invisible to the people who originally collected it, something that modern testing might finally recognize. The possibility was significant, but investigators knew they had to be careful. DNA could tell them that a person's biological material was present. It could potentially identify someone, but it could not automatically tell them exactly what that person had done. That distinction was critical. A person could have touched something before a crime. They could have visited the cabin. They could have handled an object for an innocent reason, or the material could have been transferred indirectly. Investigators therefore needed more than a laboratory result. They needed context. They needed a timeline, and they needed other evidence. That was why the old case was being examined from so many directions. The DNA was one piece. The weapons were another. The witness statements were another. And the relationships between the people involved were another. The investigators were effectively asking the same question in several different ways. Who had the opportunity? Who had the connection? Who had the possible motive? And who could be tied to the physical evidence? The answers did not immediately point to one person, but they were beginning to create a narrower circle. One name that continued to appear was Martin Smart. Smart had lived near the Sharp family. His stepson had been close to the Sharp children, and his own relationship with Sue Sharp had reportedly been complicated. That made him someone investigators could not simply ignore. But there was a crucial problem. Smart was dead. He could not be interviewed again. He could not respond to new evidence. And he could not explain his statements. That meant investigators had to rely on what he had left behind. Old interviews, old statements, old relationships, and the letter that had attracted so much attention. The letter was disturbing because of its reference to 4 people's lives. But investigators could not simply interpret those words as a confession. A sentence can have different meanings depending on its context. Without the full context, it remained ambiguous. And ambiguity is one of the biggest problems in a cold case. A clue can seem obvious when viewed alongside everything that happened afterward. But investigators have to ask what that clue meant before anyone knew the future. That is why the letter could be suspicious without being definitive. The same principle applied to the missing hammer. Smart had reportedly said that a hammer was missing. Then, decades later, a hammer was recovered from a pond near Ketty. The discovery was unusual. It deserved attention, but investigators could not simply assume that it was the murder weapon. The object had to be examined. Could it be linked to the injuries? Could biological material be recovered? Could it be connected to the cabin? Could its history be established? And even if it once belonged to Smart, did that prove he used it? Every answer required another question. That was the reality of the investigation. Nothing was simple. The case had too many possible explanations, and too little evidence that could be considered conclusive. Still, investigators continued, because the evidence had one advantage. It could not change its story. People could forget. People could misremember. People could change their statements. But an object remained what it was. A piece of tape remained a piece of tape. A weapon remained a weapon. A photograph remained a photograph. The challenge was understanding what each object was telling them. And the more investigators examined the old evidence, the more important the crime scene became. Cabin 28 had been the beginning. It was where the victims were found. It was where the violence happened. And it was where the killer, or killers, had spent the final moments before leaving. That meant the cabin contained the strongest possibility of finding a direct connection. Investigators went back through the old photographs. They examined the position of objects. They examined the condition of the rooms. They studied the restraints. They considered what the physical scene suggested about the sequence of events. The goal was not simply to see what had happened. It was to determine how it happened. That distinction mattered. If investigators could understand the sequence, they could potentially determine how many people were involved. They could understand where each victim had been, and they could determine whether the crime appeared planned or spontaneous. The scene suggested that the victims had been controlled. That meant the attacker had some degree of power over them. But whether that power came from physical strength, threats, surprise, or multiple attackers remained uncertain. The investigators also considered the possibility that the victims knew the person who entered. If the attacker was familiar, that could explain why the confrontation did not immediately become chaotic. But it was only a theory. There was no definitive proof. And there was another important question. Why would someone murder Sue Sharp? If she was the intended target, investigators needed to understand her relationships. If John or Dana were the targets, they needed to understand theirs. And if the attack was random, they needed to understand why the victims were restrained and why Tina disappeared. The motive remained the missing piece. Without motive, investigators could potentially identify a person but still struggle to understand the entire crime. But motive is not always necessary to prove a murder. Evidence can be enough. A person does not have to confess a reason for committing a crime if forensic evidence can establish what they did. That was why the DNA evidence mattered so much. If investigators could connect the biological material to a person who also had an opportunity to commit the murders, the combination would be much stronger. This was the direction the investigation was moving. Not toward one dramatic revelation, toward several pieces fitting together. And there was another source of information. The anonymous call. Someone had contacted authorities after Tina's remains were discovered. The caller appeared to know about the case. But who was the caller? That question remained unanswered. Investigators could listen to the recording. They could analyze the voice. They could compare the circumstances surrounding the call. But identifying a voice decades later is difficult. People's voices change. Recordings deteriorate. And without a known comparison sample, even sophisticated analysis can have limitations. Still, the call represented something important. Someone out there had known something. Whether that knowledge came from direct involvement or simply from following the case was unknown. But the possibility that the caller had inside information could not be ignored. Investigators therefore kept looking. And as they looked, the case began to reveal another uncomfortable reality. A murder investigation is not only about the person who committed the crime. It is also about everyone around that person. Friends, neighbors, family members, co-workers, people who might have heard something, people who might have seen something, people who might have noticed a change in behavior after the murders. Sometimes the person who knows the most is not the killer. It is someone who was told, someone who was shown something, or someone who became suspicious but decided to remain silent. That possibility was particularly important in Ketty, because the community was small. People knew one another. Information could travel quickly, and yet the murders remained unexplained. That meant someone may have known something without ever bringing it forward. Fear can be powerful. So can loyalty. So can guilt. A person might remain silent for many different reasons. and investigators could not assume that silence meant involvement. But they could ask why. That was one of the questions surrounding the people connected to the case. What did they know? When did they know it? And why did they say what they said? The investigation also revisited the timeline surrounding the discovery of the bodies. When the police entered cabin 28, the scene was already still. The violence was over. The killer was gone. But some of the surviving children were alive. That meant the attackers had left them behind. The decision to leave the children alive was potentially meaningful. Perhaps the attacker believed they had not seen anything. Perhaps the attacker did not care whether they survived. Perhaps the attack had not been planned in the way investigators imagined. Or perhaps the attacker had another reason for leaving them alive. Again, there was no definitive answer. But each possibility changed the way investigators interpreted the scene. The same was true of Tina. She was not simply left behind. She disappeared. That difference was enormous. Someone made a decision involving her. And that decision created a second crime scene somewhere far away. The location where Tina was found, therefore, became an extension of cabin 28. The investigation could not treat the two locations separately. They had to be connected. Something happened in Ketty. Then something happened afterward. And eventually Tina's story ended in Butte County. If investigators could identify the bridge between those events, they might understand the entire case. The problem was that the bridge was missing. There was no confirmed account of Tina's journey. No verified witness who could describe the entire trip. No definitive record of who transported her. And no established motive explaining why she was taken. That left a huge gap in the timeline. But investigators were now looking for ways to fill it. They considered vehicles. They considered roads. They considered people who could have traveled between the locations. And they considered the possibility that the person responsible had help. If two people were involved, one could potentially remain with Tina while another handled transportation. But once again, there was no conclusive evidence proving multiple attackers. The theory remained only a possibility. This was a recurring theme. The case contained many plausible explanations. But plausibility was not proof. Investigators had to resist the temptation to treat a compelling theory as a fact. That was especially important because the Ketty murders had become well known. Stories about the case had circulated for years. Books had been written. Articles had been published. People had formed opinions. And once a theory becomes popular, it can influence how new evidence is interpreted. Investigators had to work against that. They needed to return to the evidence itself. And when they did, the physical evidence kept pulling them back toward one question. Who had been inside cabin 28? The tape could potentially answer part of that. The biological material could potentially answer another part. The weapons might provide another connection. And the statements could help establish the timeline. If enough of those pieces pointed toward the same person, the case could change dramatically. But investigators also knew that old evidence can produce false hope. A DNA profile might not match anyone in the available databases. A fingerprint might be incomplete. An object might not be connected to the crime at all. A witness might remember something incorrectly. Every lead could end in a dead end. That had happened before. And yet the case continued. Because one of the strongest reasons to keep investigating a cold case is simple. The victims cannot speak. Someone has to speak for them. Someone has to continue asking the questions. And someone has to keep looking when everyone else has moved on. For the families, the investigation was never simply history. It was personal. Decades had passed, but the loss had not disappeared. And Tina's family had lived with an especially painful uncertainty. They had spent years not knowing where she was. When her remains were finally discovered, they gained an answer, but not justice. The person responsible remained unidentified. That meant the case was still incomplete, and investigators were determined to see whether the new evidence could finally change that. One of the most promising possibilities remained the DNA evidence. If the profile could be connected to a person, investigators could compare that person's background with the timeline. They could ask whether the person had any connection to Ketty, whether they knew the Sharp family, whether they had a reason to be there, and whether they could have been involved in Tina's disappearance. The DNA itself could not answer all of those questions, but it could potentially give investigators a name, and a name changes everything. A name can be investigated, A name can be placed on a timeline. A name can be connected to witnesses. A name can be compared with old statements. And a name can be tested against the physical evidence. That was what investigators hoped for. But the investigation still needed to move carefully, because identifying someone connected to a piece of evidence is not the same as proving murder. The evidence had to survive scrutiny. It had to make sense, and it had to fit with the rest of the story. The investigators therefore continued to compare. They compared the old case with the new evidence. They compared witness statements with physical evidence. They compared timelines. They compared relationships. And slowly, the case began to form a clearer outline. There was still no complete answer, but there were fewer places to look, and fewer possibilities that could explain everything. The most important question now was whether the person connected to the evidence could also be connected to the events of April 11th, 1981. If that connection existed, the investigation could move forward. If it did not, the case would remain uncertain. Either way, the evidence had done something important. It had given investigators another direction. After decades of theories, they finally had the possibility of following something physical. Something that did not depend entirely on memory. Something that had been inside the cabin. Something that had survived. And that evidence was about to lead investigators toward a person whose name had not always been at the center of public attention. A person connected to the case in a way that would force investigators to reconsider the old timeline. Because sometimes the most important clue in a cold case is not the clue that identifies the killer immediately. It is the clue that tells investigators where they were wrong. And in Ketty, there was still a possibility that the original investigation had focused too heavily on the obvious people. The answer might have been closer, or farther away. It might have been someone already questioned, or someone who had never been considered. But the evidence was beginning to narrow the path. And once that path became clearer, investigators would have to revisit the people connected to the cabin one more time. Not simply as suspects, but as pieces of a timeline. Who was present? Who could have arrived? Who could have left? Who could have transported Tina? And who could have known what happened afterward? Those questions were waiting, and the evidence was finally strong enough to ask them again. The Ketty case had spent decades in darkness. But darkness does not always mean that nothing remains. Sometimes the smallest trace survives. A fragment of biological material. A forgotten object. A recording. A sentence written years earlier. And sometimes, when those fragments are placed together, they begin to tell the same story. The investigators were not there yet. But they were closer. And the next step would take them deeper into the names, relationships, and statements surrounding Cabin 28. Because somewhere in that circle was a person who knew more than they had ever admitted. And investigators were about to look at that circle differently. For decades, the Ketty murders had been surrounded by names. Some belonged to the victims, some belonged to witnesses, and some belonged to people investigators had once considered possible suspects. But a name appearing in a police report did not make someone a killer. That distinction became more important as the case was reopened. Investigators had to separate what was proven from what was simply suspected. They had to examine old theories without automatically accepting them. And most importantly, they had to follow the evidence wherever it led. One of the names that continued to appear was Martin Smart. Smart had lived close to the Sharp family. His stepson had been friends with the Sharp children, and his relationship with Sue Sharp had reportedly been troubled. Those facts made him relevant, but relevance was not guilt. Smart had never been convicted of the murders, and by the time the investigation was renewed, he was no longer alive to answer questions. That meant investigators had to reconstruct his connection to the case through the evidence he had left behind. His statements, his relationships, his movements, and the objects associated with him. The same was true of John Babade. Babade had been connected to Smart and had been in the Ketty area. His name therefore remained part of the investigation. But again, suspicion was not proof. The investigators had to determine whether there was anything that could physically connect either man to the crime. That brought them back to the evidence. The tape, the weapons, the possible DNA, the crime scene, and the timeline. If a person could be connected to one of those things, investigators could begin asking more specific questions. Where was that person on the night of April 11th? Did they know Sue? Did they know John or Dana? Did they know Tina? Could they have entered cabin 28? And could they have left Ketty afterward? The answers had to fit together. A single suspicious detail was not enough, but several independent details could become significant. This was particularly important with the DNA. Modern forensic testing had produced a profile from biological material associated with the tape. That result gave investigators something they had not possessed in 1981, a potential genetic connection, but investigators still had to establish what that connection meant. The person associated with the DNA might have been involved, or the material could have arrived there for another reason. The investigators therefore needed corroboration. They needed to know whether the person had a relationship with the victims, whether they had access to cabin 28, and whether their movements placed them near the crime scene. The timeline became critical. A person might have had a motive. They might have known the family. They might have even left biological material at the scene. But if they could prove they were somewhere else when the murders occurred, the theory would have to be reconsidered. That was why the renewed investigation was not simply a search for DNA. It was a reconstruction. The investigators were trying to rebuild the night from fragments. And one of the most important fragments remained the surviving children. Their memories could potentially reveal what happened inside the cabin before the attack. But their memories had to be handled carefully. The children had been young. They had experienced trauma, and decades had passed. Investigators therefore compared early statements with later recollections. They wanted to know which details had remained consistent. They also wanted to identify details that had changed. A consistent detail could be valuable. A changing detail did not necessarily mean a witness was lying. Memory can change, especially when a person has spent years hearing theories about the same event. That was one reason investigators had to return to the earliest available statements. What had the children said before the case became widely discussed? What had they remembered before they knew what investigators suspected? Those early memories could potentially be more useful than later interpretations. But even the surviving children's memories could not answer every question. They could not explain exactly where Tina went. They could not necessarily identify the killer. And they could not provide a complete timeline. That meant physical evidence remained essential. The investigation therefore continued moving between people and objects, between memories and facts, between what was believed and what could actually be proven. And that distinction was becoming increasingly important. Over the years, the Ketty case had developed a mythology of its own. People had formed theories. Some theories were based on real evidence. Others grew from rumors. And some were repeated so often that people began treating them as established facts. Investigators could not work that way. They needed to return to the beginning. For people were murdered. Tina disappeared. Her remains were found years later. The crime scene contained evidence of restraint. Biological material survived. A hammer was eventually discovered near Ketty, and several people had connections to the victims. Those were facts that could be investigated. Everything else had to be tested. That process brought investigators back to the question of motive. If Martin Smart was involved, what was his reason? If John Babade was involved, what was his reason? If someone else was responsible, what had caused the attack? The answer remained unclear. And perhaps the motive was not as simple as investigators had hoped. Sometimes a murder is not caused by one event. Sometimes it grows from a relationship, an argument, a resentment, a fear, or a combination of several problems. That possibility was important in Ketty because the people involved were not complete strangers. There were connections between families, friendships, neighbors, and personal disagreements. The killer may have known at least some of the victims. But again, that did not prove who the killer was. Investigators had to be careful not to confuse proximity with responsibility. The fact that someone lived nearby did not mean they committed the murders. The fact that someone had argued with a victim did not mean they wanted the victim dead. And the fact that someone's name appeared in an old investigation did not make them guilty. The case needed evidence. That was why the DNA evidence was so important. If it could be connected to a known person, investigators could begin testing the theory. And if that person also had a connection to Ketty, the evidence would become more significant. But there was still another issue. What if the DNA belonged to someone investigators had never suspected? That possibility could completely change the case. It would mean the decades of attention surrounding the familiar names had potentially been misplaced, and that was why investigators could not focus exclusively on the old suspects. The evidence had to lead, not the reputation of a person, not public opinion, not a popular theory. The evidence. This approach also meant revisiting people who had never received much attention. Someone could have been present around Ketty without being considered important. Someone could have known the victims casually. Someone could have had access to the cabin. And someone could have left town afterward. A cold case often contains people who were overlooked simply because investigators did not know what to ask at the time. Modern investigators could ask different questions. They could also search records that had not existed before, and they could compare information across decades. That was one of the biggest advantages of reopening an old case. The investigators had hindsight. They knew what happened afterward. They knew Tina was eventually found. They knew which people had moved. They knew which statements had changed. And they knew which evidence had survived. But hindsight could also be dangerous. Knowing the ending can make the beginning appear obvious. Investigators had to resist that temptation. They had to reconstruct the case as it existed in 1981. Only then could they understand what the original investigators knew and what they did not. The more they did that, the more they noticed gaps. Some evidence had not been tested with modern technology. Some statements had not been compared carefully. Some objects had never been connected to the larger timeline. And some possibilities had simply been dismissed. One of those possibilities concerned the relationship between the murders and Tina's disappearance. Were they one event, or were they two connected events? That question was crucial. If Tina had been taken because she witnessed the murders, then her disappearance was part of the same crime. But if something else happened to her later, investigators would need to understand a different timeline. The evidence did not provide an easy answer, but the location where her remains were discovered strongly suggested that her story continued beyond the cabin. That meant the person responsible had either traveled with her or arranged for her to be moved, and that required planning or opportunity. Investigators therefore examined transportation, vehicles, roads, possible routes, and people who had access to them. The problem was that so much time had passed. A vehicle from 1981 might no longer exist. A road might have changed. A witness might not remember seeing anything. And records that could have helped might have disappeared. Still, even incomplete evidence could be useful. A person who claimed to be somewhere could be compared against other accounts. A vehicle could be compared with known descriptions. And a person's relationship to Tina could be examined. The goal was not to prove everything from one clue. It was to build a chain, one link at a time, and eventually, that chain might become strong enough. The investigation also raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if someone had helped cover up the crime? That did not necessarily mean they were involved in the murders. A person could learn something afterward. They could become frightened. They could help someone hide evidence. Or they could simply decide not to speak. If that happened, investigators might be dealing with two different levels of involvement. The person who committed the murders, and the person who knew. That distinction mattered because a witness who remained silent could still possess information that could solve the case. The investigators therefore continued searching for anyone who might have known more than they had said. But there was a limit. Some people were gone, some had died, and some had taken their secrets with them. That reality made the surviving evidence even more important. The tape, the DNA, the hammer, the letter, the crime scene, the anonymous call. Every surviving piece could potentially provide a connection. And slowly, investigators began seeing that the case might not be solved through one dramatic discovery. It might be solved by combining several smaller discoveries. That is often how cold cases move forward. One clue points toward a person. Another clue establishes the timeline. A third clue provides physical evidence. And suddenly, what once seemed like coincidence begins to look like a pattern. The Ketty investigation was approaching that point, but there was still a major obstacle. The evidence had to survive the question. Could it actually place someone at cabin 28 during the murders? That was the standard investigators needed. Not simply knowing the family. Not simply living nearby. Not simply having a possible motive. Being there. That was the key. and the DNA evidence offered a possible path toward answering that question. But before investigators could draw conclusions, they had to understand exactly what the DNA represented. Was it from the killer? Was it from someone who had touched the tape earlier? Was it transferred? Was the profile complete? And could it be matched to anyone? Those questions were still being worked through, but investigators had reached a point that the original team could hardly have imagined. The evidence from 1981 was speaking in a language that modern science could understand. The problem was translating it correctly, because one wrong interpretation could send the entire investigation in the wrong direction. So investigators kept looking, and the more they looked, the more the old names remained relevant, but no longer alone. Smart, Bobaid, the people around the Sharp family, the people who had been in Keddy, the people who had traveled away, and the people who had remained silent. All of them were pieces, but none of them by themselves was the answer. The real answer had to connect the cabin to the evidence to a person, and that person to the timeline. Only then could investigators move from suspicion to something stronger. Meanwhile, the families continued waiting. Decades had passed, but the passage of time had not erased what happened. The victims remained victims. The unanswered questions remained unanswered. And the person responsible had never stood in court to explain what happened. That was why the renewed investigation mattered. It was not about satisfying curiosity. It was about finishing something that had been left incomplete. The investigators now had modern forensic tools. They had old evidence, and they had a case that had never truly been solved. The pieces were there. They just had to be connected. And then came one of the most important developments in the entire investigation. A piece of evidence that had existed for decades began pointing toward a specific person. Not because someone suddenly confessed, not because a witness finally came forward, but because modern forensic analysis could potentially connect the past to someone living, or someone who had once lived, in the circle around Keddy. For the first time, investigators had a reason to ask a very specific question. Was the person connected to the evidence also connected to the murders? If the answer was yes, the case could change forever. But there was still a long way between a clue and a conviction. The evidence had to be tested. The timeline had to fit. And investigators had to determine whether the connection was genuine. The next stage would bring the case closer to its most important forensic question. A question that had been impossible to answer in 1981. But decades later, technology had finally made it possible to ask. Who left the trace behind? And if investigators could identify that person, they might finally understand who had entered Cabin 28 on that terrible night. For more than 3 decades, the Keddy murders had remained a case built around questions. Who entered Cabin 28? Who attacked the people inside? Who took Tina? And why? The original investigators had worked with the technology available to them in 1981. They collected evidence. They photographed the scene. They preserved objects. They interviewed witnesses. But there were limits to what science could reveal at the time. Decades later, those limits had changed. DNA analysis had become one of the most powerful tools available to investigators. And suddenly, evidence collected in 1981 could be examined in ways that the original investigators could never have imagined. That did not mean the case was suddenly solved. It meant the evidence could finally be asked a new question. Who had touched it? One of the most important items was the tape associated with the restraints. The tape had been present during the attack, and biological material had been recovered from it. Investigators hoped that modern testing could produce a usable genetic profile. If it did, the profile might provide a direction. But there was a problem. A DNA profile is only useful if investigators can identify whose DNA it is. If the person is not already in a database, the profile may remain anonymous. And even when a name is found, investigators still need to establish why that person's DNA was present. That meant the forensic result would not automatically answer the larger mystery. It would simply open another door. Still, that door had been closed in 1981. Now investigators had a chance to open it. They examined the biological material. They compared what could be recovered. And they began searching for connections. The evidence was old, but DNA does not care how many years have passed if the biological material has been preserved well enough. The information can remain. And that possibility gave the investigators something they had not possessed before: a scientific lead. The question was whether that lead would point toward one of the familiar names, or toward someone completely unexpected. If it pointed toward a known suspect, investigators could revisit that person's history. If it pointed toward someone unknown, the case could take an entirely different direction. Either way, the evidence had the potential to change the story. But the investigators also understood something important. A DNA match would not tell them everything. It would not necessarily tell them when the person was at cabin 28. It would not explain why they were there. And it would not automatically prove that they committed the murders. The forensic result had to be combined with the timeline. That was why the investigation remained focused on April 11th, 1981. The investigators wanted to know where every relevant person had been, what they had done, who had seen them, and whether their movements were consistent with the evidence. The old statements became important again. A person might have said one thing in 1981. Another detail might appear years later. Investigators compared the versions. They looked for changes. They looked for contradictions. And they looked for details that could be independently confirmed. This process was especially important because the case had been discussed for decades. Once a murder becomes famous, people hear theories. They read articles. They hear rumors. And eventually, those stories can become mixed with memory. Investigators, therefore, had to determine what people actually knew at the time. That was difficult, but necessary. The evidence had to be separated from the mythology, and that brought investigators back to the people who had been closest to the crime. The Sharp family, the neighbors, the people around Ketty, and the people whose names had remained connected to the case. Martin Smart was still one of those names, but by this point, investigators were not simply asking whether Smart looked suspicious. They were asking something more precise. Could evidence connect him to the murders? Could evidence connect him to the tape? Could evidence connect him to Tina? And could his movements fit the timeline? The same questions applied to John Babade, and to everyone else who might have had an opportunity. That was a different kind of investigation. Instead of asking who seemed capable of murder, investigators were asking who could be scientifically connected to the crime. That difference was crucial, because suspicion can survive for decades. Evidence has to survive scrutiny, and as the forensic work continued, investigators began to see how difficult that distinction could be. Suppose DNA belonged to someone who had known the family. That would be interesting, but if that person had regularly visited cabin 28, the DNA could have been deposited before the murders. Suppose DNA belonged to someone who had never been known to enter the cabin. That could be much more significant, but investigators would still need to explain how the person came into contact with the evidence. Every result created another question. That was frustrating, but it was also progress, because every legitimate question narrowed the possibilities. The investigation also returned to the physical condition of the tape. How had it been used? Where had it been? What kind of contact could have transferred biological material onto it? Could the material have come from the attacker? Could it have come from one of the victims? Could it have been transferred during the handling of the evidence? These questions were not merely technical. They could determine whether the DNA was actually meaningful. The investigators therefore had to work with forensic experts. They needed to understand what the evidence could prove, and what it could not. That was particularly important in a case where people had already developed strong theories. The science had to remain separate from the speculation, and while the forensic work continued, another piece of evidence remained in the background: the hammer. When the hammer was discovered near Ketty decades later, investigators could not ignore it. The object was reportedly similar to one that Martin Smart had previously said was missing. That connection made the discovery interesting. But investigators had to determine whether the hammer could actually be connected to the murders. If it contained biological material, that might help. If it could be linked to injuries, that might help. If its history could be established, that might help. But if none of those things could be proven, the hammer would remain only a possibility. Again, the case required patience. The same was true of the letter connected to Smart. Its reference to 4 people's lives had attracted attention. But investigators could not simply interpret that phrase as a confession. The meaning was uncertain. The timing was important. The context was important, and the identity of the people being referred to had to be established. The letter could be significant, or it could be unrelated. Without additional evidence, investigators could not know. This was becoming a pattern. The Ketty case was full of clues that looked important, but very few could stand alone. The real breakthrough would have to involve multiple pieces. That was why the DNA evidence was potentially so valuable. A genetic profile could be compared against a suspect. Then that suspect could be placed into the timeline. Then their relationship with the victims could be examined. Then other physical evidence could be compared. If all of those things aligned, the theory would become much stronger. But if they contradicted one another, investigators would have to step back. The evidence could not be forced to fit. And this was where the investigation began to move away from the old assumptions. The investigators did not need to prove that a particular person was guilty. They needed to determine whether the person could be connected to the physical evidence. That was the first step, and the DNA gave them that opportunity. For years, the case had depended heavily on witness accounts. Now there was something different, something measurable, something that could potentially be compared against people. That did not guarantee a match, but it created hope. And for the families, even hope was meaningful, because the case had been stagnant for so long. Every new test meant another possibility, another chance, another opportunity to learn something that had been impossible to know before. The investigators also knew that the person responsible might not be alive. After so many decades, that was unavoidable. People age, people die, and if the killer had died, investigators would not be able to confront them. But a DNA connection could still identify them. It could potentially reveal who had been connected to the evidence. And then investigators could reconstruct that person's life, where they lived, who they knew, where they were in 1981, and whether they had any connection to Ketty. This was one of the most powerful possibilities of modern forensic investigation. A dead suspect could not speak, but their DNA could, and so investigators continued. They examined the profile, they considered possible matches, and they began looking at people connected to the case in a new way. The question was no longer, did this person seem suspicious? It was, does the evidence place this person inside the story? That was a much harder standard, but it was also much more reliable. And as the investigation progressed, the possibility of a specific connection became more important. The evidence was not necessarily enough to prove the entire crime, but it could potentially place a person at the center of the investigation. That person could then be compared with the timeline. And the timeline was critical. If the person was in Ketty during the murders, the evidence would become much more significant. If they were somewhere else, the connection would have to be explained. This was the point where forensic science and old-fashioned detective work came together. DNA could provide a name, but detectives had to provide the story. They had to establish how the person got there, why they might have gone there, who they knew, and what happened afterward. The crime itself had lasted only a short time, but solving it required reconstructing decades. That was the challenge, and it was also the reason the case remained open. There was still enough evidence to investigate. The investigation also returned to the question of Tina. If the DNA pointed toward someone connected to Cabin 28, investigators had to ask whether the same person could have been connected to her disappearance. That would be critical, because the person responsible for the murders and the person responsible for Tina's death might have been the same. If so, the connection could potentially explain both crimes. But if not, investigators would have to consider whether another person was involved afterward. Again, the evidence would have to decide. The distance between Ketty and the place where Tina was found remained one of the biggest mysteries. Someone had transported her. Someone had chosen where she would be left. And someone had managed to keep that secret. That required either knowledge, planning, or both. The investigators therefore examined possible routes. They considered who could have traveled them, and they looked for anything that could connect a person to the journey. But 1981 left very little digital evidence. There were no cell towers documenting movements, no GPS history, no security cameras at every intersection. The investigation had to rely on old-fashioned evidence. Witnesses, vehicles, records, and physical traces. That was why the DNA evidence was so valuable. It was one of the few pieces of evidence that could survive decades without relying on memory. But even DNA had to be interpreted carefully. A profile can identify a person. It cannot automatically explain intent. It cannot automatically establish the exact moment of contact. And it cannot replace the rest of the investigation. So the investigators kept building. The DNA was one brick. The timeline was another. The witness statements were another. The crime scene was another. And the possible weapons were another. The goal was to build something strong enough that the case could finally stand. But there was still uncertainty. The Ketty murders had never been officially solved. No one had been convicted, and many of the theories surrounding the case remained theories. That meant the investigators had to remain cautious. They could not tell the families that they had the answer until they could prove it. They could not tell the public that a suspect was the killer simply because the evidence looked promising. They had to wait, test, compare, and test again. That patience was frustrating, but it was necessary, because the worst possible outcome would be accusing the wrong person. The goal was not simply to close the case. It was to close it correctly, and perhaps that was the most important change between 1981 and the renewed investigation. The original investigators had been trying to solve a crime with limited technology. The new investigators were trying to solve it without allowing decades of assumptions to control their thinking. They had the advantage of modern science, but they also had to overcome the weight of history. Every old theory had to be examined. Every old statement had to be questioned. Every piece of evidence had to be interpreted in context. And slowly, the investigation was moving toward a more specific picture. The person connected to the forensic evidence was not necessarily the entire answer. But the connection was important. It gave investigators somewhere to look. And sometimes in a cold case, that is the first real breakthrough. A direction, a name, a possibility, something that can be investigated, something that can be tested, something that can finally be challenged. For decades, the Ketty murders had been a mystery without a clear path. Now there was a path, but there was still one final obstacle. The investigators needed to determine whether the forensic evidence could be connected to the actual events of that night. Because the difference between being connected to an object and being connected to a murder is enormous. That gap had to be crossed, and to cross it, investigators needed to bring together everything they had learned. The timeline, the relationships, the crime scene, the DNA, the weapons, the anonymous call, and Tina's disappearance. Only when those pieces were placed together could investigators decide whether the new evidence represented a genuine breakthrough or another dead end. The case had waited more than 30 years. It could wait a little longer, but the evidence was no longer completely silent. Something had been left behind, something that might eventually tell investigators who had been inside cabin 28. And as the forensic work continued, one question became impossible to ignore. What if the person who left that trace had never been properly investigated in 1981? If that was true, then the case had been looking in the wrong direction for decades. And if investigators could prove it, the entire story would have to be reconsidered. The old names might no longer be enough. The old theories might no longer matter, because the evidence could point toward someone else. Someone who had been hiding in the background of the story. Someone whose connection to the case had not been fully understood. And once investigators followed that connection, they would finally reach the last major question. Not simply who had been near cabin 28, not simply who had a possible motive, but who could be connected to the crime through evidence that had survived for more than 30 years. The answer was getting closer, and for the first time, the case was no longer moving only through memories. It was moving through science. More than 40 years have passed since the night everything changed inside cabin 28. The people who entered that cabin are gone from the scene now. The children who survived that night grew older. The investigators who first walked through the cabin are no longer working the case. And yet the questions remain. Who killed Sue Sharp? Who killed John and Dana? Who took Tina? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, why did the truth remain hidden for so long? The Ketty murders began as a shocking crime in a small community. But the story became much larger than the cabin itself. It became a story about missing evidence, about memories, about theories, about a little girl who disappeared, and about a family that spent years waiting for answers. When Tina's remains were eventually discovered in 1984, her family finally learned what had happened to her. But they still did not know who was responsible. That distinction matters. Finding Tina ended one part of the mystery. It did not end the investigation. The person who had taken her remained unknown. The person responsible for the murders remained unknown. And the families were left with an answer that was painful but incomplete. Over the years, investigators returned to the case again and again. Some followed old leads. Others looked at the evidence with modern technology. The goal remained the same: to find something that could connect a person to the crime, something that could survive the passage of time, something that could transform suspicion into evidence. The physical evidence became increasingly important. Old objects were examined again. Old statements were compared. Old theories were reconsidered. And forensic science offered possibilities that investigators in 1981 could never have imagined. DNA became one of those possibilities. A trace left behind decades earlier could potentially identify a person. But even modern science has limits. A DNA profile does not tell an entire story. It can tell investigators that biological material is associated with someone. It does not automatically explain why it was there. That is why the Ketty case remained complicated. Every clue had to be placed into context. The tape had to be understood. The weapons had to be understood. The timeline had to be understood. And Tina's disappearance had to be understood. The investigation could not stop at one discovery. It had to connect the discoveries. That is what investigators attempted to do. And perhaps the most frustrating part of the case was that there were enough clues to keep the mystery alive, but not enough definitive evidence to end it. There were names. There were theories. There were suspicious circumstances. But there was no courtroom verdict. No confession that could be independently verified. No complete reconstruction of the night. That left the case in an unusual place. It was neither forgotten nor solved. It existed somewhere in between. A cold case that continued to attract attention because the evidence had never completely disappeared. The people connected to the case also changed over time. Some died. Others moved away, and some lived for decades with questions that could never be answered. For the surviving members of the Sharp family, the passage of time could not erase the loss. The murders happened in one night, but their consequences lasted a lifetime. There was no normal morning after that night, no simple return to the way things had been. Instead, there were police interviews, funerals, questions, and eventually years of silence. Tina's disappearance made the situation even more painful. For years, there was always the possibility that she might somehow be found alive. That hope can be difficult to understand unless you have lived through it. When a person disappears, their family does not immediately have a final answer. There is uncertainty. There are possibilities. There is the question of whether the person might return. And every passing day can create a different kind of fear. When Tina's remains were discovered, that uncertainty finally ended. But the grief remained, and so did the question of who had done it. The case also became an example of how difficult a murder investigation can become when the original evidence is incomplete. A crime scene can only be examined once in its original condition. Once people enter, once objects are moved, once evidence is collected, that moment is gone forever. Investigators in 1981 had to make decisions based on what they understood at the time. They did not have the benefit of knowing which details would become important decades later. They could not predict the development of modern forensic science, and they could not know that the case would remain unsolved for so long. That is one reason cold case investigations are so difficult. The investigator is trying to reconstruct the past without being able to return to it. But the past leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are physical. Sometimes they are written. Sometimes they exist in someone's memory. And sometimes they exist in the gaps between different stories. That is why the Ketty case continued to be examined. Investigators wanted to know whether those gaps could finally be filled. One of the biggest questions remained the number of people involved. Was there one attacker? Were there several? Did someone enter the cabin alone? Did another person arrive later? Was Tina taken by the same person responsible for the murders? Or did someone else become involved afterward? The evidence has allowed different possibilities to be discussed. But without definitive proof, none of those theories can simply be presented as fact. That is an important lesson from the case. A mystery can have a very convincing theory and still remain officially unsolved. Theories can explain pieces of the evidence, but a solution requires proof, and proof has to survive questioning. That is why the Ketty investigation remains so fascinating. Not because there is one perfect explanation, but because there are still pieces that do not fit comfortably together. The cabin, the restraints, the missing child, the distance between Ketty and the place where Tina was found, the surviving evidence, the names connected to the case, and the unanswered questions. Each piece creates another possibility, but the complete picture remains incomplete. And perhaps that is why the case has remained in the public memory for so many years. It is not simply a story about a murder. It is a story about a family that went to sleep in a small California community, believing that tomorrow would be ordinary. Tomorrow was not ordinary. For decades later, people are still trying to understand what happened. And there is something else worth remembering. Behind every famous cold case are real people. Sue Sharp was not simply a name in a police file. John was not simply a victim in a timeline. Dana was not simply another piece of evidence. And Tina was not simply the missing child at the center of a mystery. They were people with families, with personalities, with routines, with plans. They had ordinary lives before one terrible night changed everything. That is why telling a case like this requires more than suspense. It requires remembering the people at the center of it. The mystery is interesting, but the loss is real. And perhaps the most respectful way to tell their story is to keep that distinction clear. There are no easy answers here. There is no neat ending where every question suddenly disappears. Instead, there is a case that continues to remind investigators why evidence matters, why old cases should sometimes be revisited, why technology can change an investigation, and why a missing answer does not necessarily mean there is nothing left to discover. A piece of evidence can remain silent for decades. Then suddenly a new method can make it speak. A witness can remember something. A forgotten document can surface. A new forensic technique can reveal something that was invisible before. That possibility remains important, because even after decades, a cold case is not necessarily dead. Sometimes it is simply waiting for someone to look again, waiting for someone to ask a different question, waiting for technology to catch up with the evidence, and waiting for one small detail to connect everything. The Ketty case has had moments when that connection seemed close. Investigators have followed leads. They have examined evidence. They have considered suspects. But a final courtroom conclusion has never arrived, and that means the story remains unfinished. The families deserve something more than theories. They deserve certainty. They deserve to know who was responsible. And if the evidence eventually makes that possible, the people responsible should be held accountable according to the law. Until then, the investigation remains what it has always been. A search for the truth. Not a search for the most exciting theory. Not a search for the most popular suspect. And not a search for a story that sounds convincing. The truth. That is the standard. And that is why the final chapter of this story cannot honestly provide a perfect ending. Because the case has never received one. There are still questions. There are still theories. There are still pieces of evidence that investigators continue to examine. And there is still a possibility that something hidden in the surviving record could eventually change what we know. Perhaps that is what makes the case so haunting. A family entered cabin 28. A terrible crime occurred. One child disappeared. Years later, she was found. And yet the central mystery remained. Someone knew what happened. Someone may have carried the memory for decades. Someone may have seen something. Someone may have heard something. Someone may have left something behind. And somewhere among those people and objects may be the answer. For now, the case remains a reminder that time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes it only makes the evidence harder to find. The names may change. The investigators may change. The technology may change. But the questions remain. Who entered the cabin? Who left? Who took Tina? And who knew the truth afterward? Those questions have followed the Ketty murders for decades. And until they are answered with evidence strong enough to stand in court, the story remains unfinished. So tonight, as we leave the quiet roads of Ketty behind, there is no dramatic final confession, no sudden revelation, no convenient ending, only the facts we can establish and the questions that remain. A family lost 4 people. A little girl disappeared. Her remains were eventually found. And somewhere in the years between that terrible night and today, the person responsible carried knowledge of what happened. Maybe that person is already gone. Maybe someone still remembers. Maybe an old piece of evidence is still waiting to be understood. And maybe one day, someone will finally connect the last missing piece. Until then, the cabin remains part of a mystery that has survived more than 4 decades. Not because the past is impossible to uncover, but because sometimes the truth takes longer to find than anyone expects. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. The killer did not leave the story behind when they left cabin 28. They left questions, and those questions have remained. The Ketty murders remain an unsolved case. And for the families, that means the story is not truly over. It is simply waiting for the answer.